I hadn't heard my son's voice in 10 years. Not a call, not a message, not even a birthday card. Then, one December morning, my phone lit up with his name, Luke. For a second, my hands wouldn't move. When I finally answered, his tone was warm, rehearsed, unfamiliar. "Dad," he said, "how about Christmas at our place this year?" Outside, snow was falling against the workshop window, melting on the wood I'd been shaping alone for a decade. 10 years of silence, broken only when I became rich. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The sound of rain against the workshop roof had become Arthur Hayes's closest companion. 10 winters had passed since his son last called him Dad. 10 years of birthdays spent alone, of wrapping his own presence in silence, just to feel the weight of something that mattered. The tools on his bench were lined up like old soldiers, faithful, wordless, unchanging. He'd built furniture for half the town, but the one thing he could never mend was the distance between himself and Luke. He still wrote letters sometimes, even though he knew they'd never be read. Handwritten notes, folded neatly, placed in an old shoebox instead of a mailbox. "How's work, son? How are the kids?" His pen always trembled by the second line. Some letters he tore apart mid-sentence, afraid of sounding desperate. Others he sealed, dated, and tucked away, little tombstones of hope. When birthdays came, he bought himself a slice of cake from the corner bakery. The cashier, a kind woman named June, would smile and say, "Celebrating something?" Arthur would answer softly, "Just time passing." And when neighbors asked about Luke, about the grandkids they'd seen only once, Arthur would smile through that familiar ache in his chest and say, "They're busy, you know how life gets." Then he'd walk back home, pretending that quiet was a choice. His workshop was the only place where silence didn't feel like punishment. The smell of pine and varnish wrapped around him like an old coat, the hum of the sander, the creak of the stool. Each sound grounded him in a world that still made sense. Here, creation filled the space where love had gone missing. Every chair leg, every smooth corner, carried a piece of his endurance. Sometimes he'd run his hands over the finished wood, wondering if Luke still built anything with his own hands, or if his son's life was now all numbers and screens. Then, one late afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the bare trees, Arthur received a letter that changed the quiet rhythm of his days. It wasn't from Luke. It was from a lawyer in Philadelphia. An old business partner of his, long retired and long forgotten, had passed away and left Arthur a significant inheritance. He read the letter 3 times before believing it. His name, spelled correctly, clearly, looked foreign next to the words beneficiary. He sat in his workshop that evening, the letter trembling in his hands, and let the shock turn into something gentler, relief. For the first time in years, his future didn't look so fragile. He could fix the roof, replace the broken heater, maybe even take a trip to the coast, something his late wife had always dreamed of. It was strange, he thought, how fortune could arrive so quietly, without fanfare, after a lifetime of struggle. But as night fell and the workshop grew colder, the old ache returned. He set the letter down beside his coffee cup and stared at the telephone on the wall. It hadn't rung for anything personal in nearly a decade. He thought about how news traveled in small towns, how gossip carried faster than gratitude. Someone would mention his name, his windfall, maybe even his new truck if he bought one. And maybe, just maybe, the rumor would reach Luke. Arthur leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting toward the window. Snow had begun to fall, covering the dark world outside in quiet forgiveness. He wondered, not for the first time, if his son would ever remember the man who once taught him how to tie his first knot, how to tell the truth even when it hurt. In the stillness, he whispered into the empty room, "Would you call me then, Luke, if I had something left to give?" The wind offered no answer, only the slow, hollow ticking of the workshop clock, counting down to something Arthur couldn't yet name. In small towns like Maple Grove, secrets moved slower than winter snow, but money moved like wildfire. Arthur hadn't told anyone about the inheritance, not even June at the bakery, but somehow the story slipped into circulation within days. Maybe it was the bank teller who'd recognized his name on a large deposit slip, or the lawyer's assistant who'd whispered something over coffee. However it happened, the quiet man who once lived paycheck to paycheck was suddenly the center of everyone's curiosity. By the end of the week, people began treating him differently. The mailman lingered for small talk. The hardware store clerk offered him a loyalty discount he'd never heard of before. And when Arthur walked into the diner one morning, he noticed how conversation paused for half a breath. He could feel the shift, the invisible currency of gossip at work. Then came the article. The Maple Grove Chronicle, a modest paper read mostly by retirees and parents, ran a small column on page 3. Local craftsman donates to rebuild historic library. There was even a photo, Arthur standing awkwardly beside the town mayor, both holding an oversized check. He hadn't meant for anyone to know. The library project had been his late wife's favorite cause. Donating had felt like a quiet tribute, not an announcement. Yet there it was in print, his name in bold letters, his face frozen in modest embarrassment. That single article changed everything. The morning it came out, Arthur sat in his kitchen, glasses sliding down his nose, reading the piece again and again. The phone started ringing. Neighbors, old acquaintances, even a few people who hadn't spoken to him since the funeral years ago. "Arthur, I saw your name in the paper. Good for you," one voice chirped. "You must be doing well," another said, with that curious lilt of envy, disguised as kindness. He thanked them all, polite as ever, though every call deepened the hollow feeling in his chest. That evening, as the sky darkened over the snow-covered street, Arthur settled into his armchair and turned on the small lamp beside him. The television murmured in the background, forgotten. He reached for his tablet, more out of habit than hope. He didn't check messages often. There was never anything waiting. But tonight there was. A notification blinked softly at the corner of the screen. Luke Hayes. The name alone made his throat tighten. He clicked it open, half afraid, half in disbelief. There it was, short and simple. "Dad, can we talk?" For a long moment, Arthur just stared. The words blurred slightly as tears welled up, unbidden and unwelcome. He wiped his eyes and laughed quietly, shaking his head. 10 years. 10 long years of silence, of birthdays missed, letters unanswered, empty Christmases. And now, 6 words on a glowing screen. He whispered them aloud, testing their sound, as if the air itself might confirm they were real. He thought about ignoring it just for a while to make Luke feel what he had felt all those years. He thought about what his wife would say. "Arthur, be the bigger man." He thought about how maybe this was it, the chance, the crack in the wall, the smallest bridge being built from the other side. But under all that warmth flickered something colder, doubt. Why now? Why after so many years? Was it coincidence that Luke reached out just days after the article appeared? The timing gnawed at him. Still, against every instinct honed by disappointment, he began to type. His fingers trembled slightly, hovering over the keyboard. He deleted a dozen drafts before settling on one word, then another, then the third. Always. He hit send, heart hammering, and leaned back in his chair. The house around him seemed to hold its breath. Outside, the wind picked up, scattering dry snow across the window pane. He could almost hear his wife's voice in that whisper of air. Soft, uncertain, hopeful. The screen stayed quiet. No typing dots appeared. No reply came. Arthur waited, the glow of the tablet casting faint light across his worn hands. Somewhere deep inside, joy and suspicion wrestled for space. And as the silence stretched on, he realized the decade of distance might be over, or it might just be beginning again in a different way. The call came 2 days after that message. Arthur was sanding a chair leg when his phone began to buzz across the workbench, the old ringtone echoing in the stillness of the shop. For a moment, he didn't recognize the number, but when he saw the name, Luke Hayes, his hand froze mid-motion. The sander hummed uselessly against the wood before he shut it off. The silence that followed was deafening. He hesitated, thumb hovering over the answer button. 10 years of absence couldn't be undone by one phone call, but something inside him, some small, loyal part that still remembered a boy with scraped knees and a shy smile, pushed him to pick up. "Hello?" His voice cracked, betraying the weight of years behind that single word. "Dad." Luke's voice was low, measured, as if each syllable had been practiced in the mirror. There was a nervous rhythm beneath it, controlled, polite, unfamiliar. "It's been a while." Arthur swallowed, forcing a breath. "It has." The pause stretched, long enough to feel like another decade. He heard faint background sounds, clinking glasses, a muffled TV, laughter that didn't belong to him. Luke cleared his throat. "Listen, I've been thinking a lot lately, about family, about Mom." Arthur felt that name land like a stone on water. Mom. The way Luke said it was cautious, almost apologetic, as if invoking her memory might break something fragile between them. "I'm having Christmas at my new home," Luke continued, voice tightening slightly around the phrase. "I'd really like it if you came this year. We could, start over. Mom would have wanted it." Arthur caught the hesitation. New home. He didn't ask what happened to the old one. Didn't ask if Luke had sold it, or if this new life was built on the same restless ambition that had once driven him away. Instead, he let the words settle, feeling their shape against his chest. His wife's name still lingered like dust in the house they'd shared. Her photograph on the mantel had watched over every lonely dinner, every birthday candle lit without family. She had always believed Luke would come back one day. "Give him time," she'd said before the cancer took her. "He's your son. He'll remember who he is." And now, here it was, a chance, fragile and unexpected, wrapped in awkward politeness. Arthur tried to speak, but his throat tightened. The air felt thick with memory. "Christmas, you said?" he managed. "Yes," Luke replied quickly, almost too quickly. "It'll be good. The kids want to meet their grandpa again. Molly's been planning everything. We'd really like to have you." Arthur closed his eyes. The word we sounded scripted, but he didn't challenge it. Maybe he was imagining the stiffness in Luke's tone, the faint impatience between breaths. Maybe he just wanted to believe it was real. Mom would have wanted it. Those words lingered longer than any promise Luke could have made. Arthur felt the years fold inward, grief, regret, stubborn silence, all colliding with that single line. He thought of his wife's final Christmas, how she'd asked him to hang the ornaments even though Luke wasn't there, how she'd smiled through tears and whispered, "Maybe next year." Arthur looked around his workshop, at the shelves lined with sawdust and quiet memories. "All right," he said softly. "I'll come." For a moment, he thought he heard relief in Luke's voice. "That's great, Dad, really great. I'll text you the address." When the call ended, Arthur stood still, phone pressed to his chest, as though the warmth might last a little longer. The room felt different now, alive, uncertain, trembling with something dangerously close to hope. He spent the evening pulling boxes down from the attic, dust-covered ornaments, each carrying a story. A paper star his wife had made when they couldn't afford a real one. A tiny wooden horse, Luke carved as a boy, his initials still etched into the base. Arthur wrapped each piece carefully, as though handling glass memories. Then he found a small red ribbon, tied around an old gift tag. To Luke, from Dad. The ink had faded, but the ache behind it hadn't. He tucked it into his pocket. As he packed his suitcase, the house around him seemed to breathe again. For the first time in a decade, there was a destination waiting at the end of December. But as he locked the door and glanced back through the frosted window, a quiet unease lingered beneath his chest. The word new echoed in his mind. Sharp as a nail, new home, new tone, new invitation. Hope flickered, fragile and bright. But even the warmest light can cast a long shadow. The road curved gently through the quiet suburbs, lined with bare maple trees dressed in frost. Arthur's old pickup looked out of place among the polished SUVs and luxury sedans that glimmered in the driveways. As he pulled up to the address Luke had texted, the navigation app announced the destination with its cheerful tone, unaware of the weight in Arthur's chest. Luke's new house wasn't a home. It was a statement. Wide windows reflected the pale winter sun. A manicured lawn stretched beneath a thin layer of snow, and a wreath hung perfectly centered on a double-door entrance that looked untouched by weather or wear. Arthur parked at the edge of the driveway, careful not to leave tire tracks too deep. He sat there for a long moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at the reflection of himself in the glass door. A tired man in a faded coat. A visitor, not a father. When the door opened, Molly appeared first. She was graceful, polished, her smile as crisp as the December air. "Arthur," she said warmly, but the warmth was practiced, the kind reserved for clients or neighbors. "So good to see you." He nodded, clutching the small bag of wrapped gifts. "Thank you for having me." She stepped aside, gesturing him in with a motion that felt rehearsed. The foyer gleamed, white marble floors, modern art on the walls, a scent of something citrus and expensive lingering in the air. For a moment, Arthur's boots felt like an intrusion, leaving traces of slush that didn't belong here. Luke appeared next, descending the staircase with a broad, confident smile. "Dad, you made it!" He hugged Arthur quickly, more gesture than emotion, then turned to his wife. "You remember Molly?" Arthur offered her another polite nod. "Of course." Two teenagers hovered at the edge of the hallway, a boy and a girl, both tall, both unfamiliar. Luke placed a hand on their shoulders. "These are the kids, Evan and Lila." Arthur smiled, but neither child moved closer. They murmured polite greetings, the kind you offer a distant relative you've been told to respect. Their eyes flickered with mild curiosity, no recognition. As they led him into the living room, Arthur's gaze caught on the walls, lined with framed photographs. Luke and Molly on vacations, family portraits in matching sweaters, graduation ceremonies, birthdays. There were smiles everywhere, but nowhere was Arthur's face. Not one picture of him holding Luke as a child, not even his late wife's portrait, the one that had once hung proudly in their old living room. It was as if history had been edited, rewritten to fit a sleeker story. Dinner was served in a dining room larger than Arthur's entire house. The table was immaculate, candles flickering in crystal holders, the food arranged like art. Conversation flowed easily for them, but not for him. They spoke about business expansions, property investments, stock performance. Luke gestured confidently as he talked about next year's projections. Molly chimed in with details about a new real estate venture. Arthur listened quietly, nodding when appropriate. When he tried to mention his workshop or the library renovation, the subject drifted elsewhere within seconds. The room hummed with polite chatter that left no space for memory or meaning. At one point, Luke poured more wine and said, almost casually, "Dad, you really did well for yourself, huh? That inheritance, it must have been quite the blessing." Arthur felt the words land like small stones. He smiled faintly. "It was unexpected." Luke laughed, but his eyes didn't. "Life has a funny way of rewarding patience." Arthur caught Molly's glance toward her husband, a quick, assessing look that lasted a heartbeat too long. It wasn't affection. It was calculation. He set down his fork, taking in the laughter, the polished furniture, the sound of his own heart steady beneath it all. In the reflection of the wine glass, he saw his face, quiet, out of place, fading at the edges of their world. That night, as the family gathered around the fireplace, Arthur realized something with cold clarity. This dinner wasn't about reunion. It was about inspection, and the man being inspected was him. The dining room shimmered under soft golden light. Crystal glasses caught the glow from the chandelier, reflecting it across silverware polished to mirror perfection. Outside, snow fell in slow silence, the kind that made the world seem peaceful if you didn't listen too closely. Inside, however, peace was an illusion. Beneath the laughter, beneath the small talk, something sharper hummed through the air. Arthur sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, a quiet observer in a scene that didn't quite belong to him. The smells of roasted turkey, cinnamon, and expensive wine filled the room, yet the warmth barely reached his chest. Molly floated between kitchen and table like a hostess on television, smiling in short, mechanical bursts. Luke, all confidence and charm, carved the roast with the flair of a man accustomed to praise. When everyone's plates were filled, Luke lifted his glass. "Well," he said, flashing that charming smile, "to family, and to new beginnings." Arthur raised his glass, eyes steady. "To new beginnings," he echoed softly. But before the clink of crystal could settle, Molly added with a laugh that felt a shade too bright. "And to wise investments." The words floated into the room like perfume, sweet, intentional, and impossible to ignore. Luke glanced her way just for a moment, a coded exchange that didn't need translation. Arthur caught it. He didn't flinch. Instead, he took a slow sip of wine, letting the flavor wash over the taste of unease. Conversation drifted easily after that. Holiday plans, the kids' schools, Molly's new business venture. Every sentence sparkled with civility, but beneath the surface, Arthur could hear the faint scraping of something transactional. The pauses between words were too long, the smiles too polished. "So, Dad," Luke began, refilling Arthur's glass before his own. "You've been doing really well lately, haven't you? The library project, that was generous. Everyone in town's talking about it." Arthur nodded, keeping his tone light. "It felt right. Your mother loved that place." Molly leaned in slightly. "She must have been proud of how you managed everything after she passed. Most people your age just slow down." Her eyes lingered on him with a practiced sympathy. "Do you ever think about retirement?" Arthur smiled faintly. "Every morning, right after my first cup of coffee." The table chuckled, but Molly didn't look away. Luke joined in, pretending casual curiosity. "You must have things pretty well set up by now. You always planned ahead better than I did. Still keeping that old workshop running?" "I am," Arthur replied, "though it's more habit than business these days." Luke nodded, swirling his wine. "Ever thought about, simplifying things, making sure everything's in order?" He didn't say will, but the word sat between them like a third presence. Arthur kept his gaze calm, his smile unbroken. "I suppose I'll get around to it eventually." Molly's hand brushed Luke's under the table, subtle, coordinated. Arthur noticed everything, the way their eyes flicked toward him, the almost imperceptible eagerness in their tones. This wasn't reconciliation. This was reconnaissance. He felt the sting of it in his chest, the old ache of being seen not as a father, but as an opportunity. The same boy who once cried over a broken toy now spoke like a man measuring inheritance. Still, Arthur didn't let it show. He'd learned long ago that silence could be armor. So he smiled. He asked questions about Luke's company, about the children's grades, about the weather. He laughed when they did, even when their laughter sounded hollow. The performance went on smoothly, each of them playing their part under the warm glow of the chandelier. When the toast ended, Luke clinked glasses once more and said softly, "To family." Arthur met his son's eyes across the table, and for a fleeting second, the wine reflected something redder, something raw. He raised his glass again and whispered, to family. The sound of Crystal meeting. Crystal was sharp, almost brittle. And though everyone smiled, Arthur felt the echo linger in his bones like a warning, proof that sometimes even love comes with terms and conditions. The morning after Christmas Eve carried a strange quiet. The snow had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving a white stillness over everything. Arthur woke early, out of habit. The house was silent, except for the low hum of the heating vents and the distant clinking of dishes from the kitchen. He could smell coffee brewing, strong, expensive, nothing like the simple drip pot he used back home. Luke appeared in the doorway, sleeves rolled neatly to his elbows, every bit the businessman. "Morning, Dad," he said brightly. "I thought I'd show you the office today, give you a little tour. Thought you'd like to see what we've built." Arthur nodded, his expression gentle but reserved. "Sure," he said, finishing his coffee. "What we've built." The words rolled in his head like loose nails. They drove downtown in Luke's sleek black SUV, the dashboard glowing with digital precision. The streets were half empty, dusted with salt and slush. Arthur sat quietly, watching the landscape shift from snow-laden neighborhoods to gleaming corporate buildings. He'd never seen this side of Luke's life, the polished one, the version that didn't need to remember the smell of sawdust or the sound of an old truck starting at dawn. When they arrived, Luke's office tower stretched high above the street, a mirror of glass and ambition. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee, printer ink, and confidence. Employees in press suits hurried past, greeting Luke with smiles that carried a hint of awe. "Morning, Mr. Hayes." "Good to see you, sir. Congratulations on the quarter results." Arthur followed quietly, hands in his coat pockets, taking it all in. The modern art on the walls, the expensive espresso machine, the sleek nameplate on the door. Luke Hayes, CEO. Luke led him into the corner office, gesturing proudly toward the skyline. "Pretty good view, huh? Sometimes I forget how far this all came. It's been a long road." Arthur stepped closer to the window. The city below shimmered with sunlight bouncing off snow, cars moving like tiny pieces in someone else's game. "It has been," he said softly. Luke leaned against his desk, grinning. "You know, people think success happens overnight. They don't see the grind, the risk, the years of sacrifice. I built this from nothing." Arthur turned, just slightly. "From nothing?" Luke laughed, missing, or ignoring, the question in his father's tone. "Well, you know what I mean. No investors, no safety net, just hard work." Arthur nodded slowly, letting the words hang in the air. He didn't remind Luke of the $25,000 he'd loaned him 15 years ago, the mortgage he'd risked to help start that nothing. He didn't mention the arguments, the nights his wife had cried over the checkbook, believing in their son's dream, even when it almost cost them their home. He simply looked at Luke's framed achievements lining the walls, plaques, awards, glossy magazine covers, and noted the recurring phrase under his son's name, the self-made man. The phrase echoed with quiet irony. After the tour, Luke ushered him into a conference room where Molly was waiting, her phone in hand, scrolling through something quickly before looking up with that same composed smile. "Arthur, good to see you. We were just talking numbers, actually. Luke's company is expanding. New branch, new market. It's a big step forward." Arthur sat down slowly, sensing where this was going before the words fully arrived. Molly folded her hands neatly. "You've always believed in Luke. This would be such a meaningful partnership, family working together." Luke added quickly, "It's a great opportunity, Dad. Solid returns, long-term growth. You could be part of something lasting." Arthur studied their faces, the polite enthusiasm, the subtle urgency behind their smiles. It wasn't conversation, it was persuasion dressed as affection. He leaned back in his chair, choosing his silence carefully. "You've both done well for yourselves," he said finally. "Your mother would have been proud." Molly smiled faintly, but her eyes flickered. just for a moment, toward Luke. A silent exchange, familiar and telling. Arthur rose from the chair. "Thank you for showing me around. It's good to see how far things have come." Luke clapped his shoulder lightly, a gesture both affectionate and dismissive. "We'll talk more later, yeah?" Arthur nodded, slipping his hands back into his coat pockets as they walked out. The elevator ride down was quiet. Luke checked his phone. Arthur watched the numbers descend. Outside, the air bit cold against his face. The building towered behind him, gleaming, unfeeling. He realized then that his son hadn't rewritten history accidentally. He'd done it deliberately. Arthur had been erased from the story to make it cleaner, sharper, more heroic. He took a deep breath, exhaled into the frozen air, and started walking back toward the car. The warmth of Christmas had already begun to fade, replaced by something colder, something that had nothing to do with winter. The night was dressed in soft jazz, laughter, and the hum of polished conversation. Luke and Molly's house glowed with the kind of light that made everything look effortless. Crystal glasses catching gold, expensive candles flickering against marble countertops, people smiling as if nothing in life ever cost them peace. Arthur stood near the corner of the living room, a quiet observer again, holding a glass of sparkling water he hadn't touched. He didn't belong here. He knew it, and so did everyone else, though no one said it aloud. The gathering was a holiday affair. Luke's business neighbors, investors, a few old friends from college. Their words floated easily, the kind of talk built on numbers, deals, and gated driveways. Arthur nodded when spoken to, smiled when needed, and kept mostly to the background, as he always had. Then, in the middle of that curated laughter, he heard it. Molly standing near the fireplace, her voice carrying just enough to be heard over the music. "Oh, it's all coming together beautifully," she said, her tone bright, confident. "Arthur's capital will be joining soon, so Luke's next phase is practically guaranteed. We'll be expanding faster than projected." Arthur's grip tightened around the glass. Arthur's capital. The words hit like ice water down his spine. Around her, heads nodded approvingly. Someone raised a glass. "That's incredible, Luke. Family support. That's what keeps good men great." Luke smiled, humble in appearance, proud underneath. "We're very fortunate," he said. "Dad's always believed in me." Laughter, compliments, toasts. Arthur didn't move for a moment. He just stood there, his heart beating slow and heavy, the music muffled in his ears. His capital joining soon. He hadn't signed a thing. He hadn't agreed to anything. And yet, here they were, publicly announcing his money like a done deal, as though his approval were a formality, as though his life's work were already theirs to spend. He set his glass down quietly and walked toward the hallway, unnoticed by most. The noise faded behind him as he stepped out onto the back porch, the cold night air cutting through the heat of humiliation burning beneath his skin. Snowflakes drifted down, silent and indifferent. A moment later, he heard the door open behind him. "Dad?" Luke's voice, soft, measured. "You all right out here?" Arthur turned slowly. "I heard Molly talking," he said, his voice even, controlled. "She said my capital would be joining your business." Luke exhaled a small laugh, the kind used to dismiss tension. "Oh, that? She just meant we've been discussing possibilities. You know how she gets excited about plans." Arthur's eyes stayed fixed on him. "You told people it was happening." Luke shrugged, adjusting his cuffs. "It's just talk, Dad. Everyone wins if it goes through. You, me, the company. It's good optics. Investors love a strong family front." Arthur said nothing. The silence stretched until Luke shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "Don't take it the wrong way. It's just business talk." Arthur nodded slowly, a faint smile on his lips. But his eyes had changed, the kind of change no one else noticed. But something inside him was different now. The polite, grateful father who'd spent years forgiving had gone quiet. What rose instead was older, sharper, more deliberate. He looked at his son and saw not just arrogance, but calculation. The same boy who once asked for help, now pretending the debt never existed. Luke glanced back toward the house, where guests still laughed and glasses clinked. "Come on, Dad. Don't overthink it. Let's enjoy the evening." Arthur's tone was calm, steady, but his words cut through the air like cold glass. "You've built something impressive, Luke. Just make sure it doesn't collapse under its own story." Luke froze, unsure whether it was advice or warning. Arthur stepped past him, back into the warm noise of the party, face unreadable. No one noticed the storm quietly forming behind his eyes. As the night wound down, Molly's laughter carried through the hall once more, oblivious. But for Arthur, the music had stopped. In the flicker of candlelight, a quiet decision settled in his chest. He would no longer play the fool. The real father, the one who built everything from nothing, had just awakened. Arthur waited 3 days before mentioning it again. He moved through Luke's house like a shadow, helpful, quiet, unobtrusive. He fixed a cabinet hinge in the kitchen, shoveled the driveway, even complimented Molly's cooking. On the surface, he was the grateful father trying to reconnect. But beneath that polite smile, a sharper calm was building. On the 4th morning, while Molly was on a call and the kids were at a friend's house, Arthur joined Luke in his home office. Sunlight spilled across the glass desk, glinting off the metal logo on the wall, Hayes & Kober Investments. Arthur stood at the doorway, hands clasped behind his back. "You know, Luke," he began casually, "I've been thinking about what you said at the party, the expansion, the family partnership. Maybe you're right. Maybe I should look into it." Luke looked up from his laptop, startled for a brief second before smoothing into a smile. "Yeah? That's great, Dad. Really great. I think you'll see how solid it is once you look at the numbers." Arthur returned the smile, slow and measured. "Why don't you bring me the paperwork then, just so I can review it? Make sure I understand what I'd be stepping into." Luke hesitated, just long enough for Arthur to notice, then nodded. "Of course. I'll have the team draft something by tomorrow." That night, Arthur sat in the guest room. Lights dimmed, listening to the faint hum of conversation downstairs. Molly's laughter drifted up through the floorboards. Every sound in this house now felt curated, rehearsed. He'd seen that kind of performance before, in business meetings, in people who wanted something. By morning, a manila envelope waited neatly outside his door, Luke's handwriting across the top. "Investment proposal. Review." Arthur carried it to the small desk by the window and began to read. The pages were dense with legal phrasing, carefully constructed paragraphs that said everything and nothing at once. He took his time, reading each line twice. At first, it all looked legitimate. Shares, projected returns, partnership terms. Then he noticed the language shift halfway through. Transfer of administrative control. Beneficiary consolidation. Subtle phrases, buried under layers of fine print. It wasn't just an investment, it was a transfer of power. Buried deep in paragraph 7 was the truth. Once signed, the document would effectively hand management, and later, ownership, of Arthur's remaining assets to Luke's company. Every cent from the trust, every property title, every account linked to Arthur's name. It was written with precision, coded in professionalism. A betrayal, printed in perfect grammar. Arthur's chest tightened, but his expression didn't change. He leaned back, the papers rustling softly in his hand. For years, he'd wondered how greed sounded when it came from your own blood. Now he knew. It sounded like polite clauses and clean margins. Later that afternoon, Luke found him in the study. "Did you get a chance to look through it?" he asked, voice light, almost casual. Arthur smiled. "I did. Thorough work. I'll need a little time to think it over." Luke nodded quickly. "Of course. No rush. Just thought I'd get the process started early." Arthur's tone stayed calm. "I appreciate that. You've built something impressive here." He could see the relief flicker across Luke's face, the belief that the hook had landed. Luke clapped him lightly on the shoulder. "We'll make it official soon, yeah?" Arthur returned the gesture with quiet steadiness. Soon. That night, when the house fell silent, he sat alone at the small desk again. The documents lay open before him, their printed ink catching the faint light from a nearby lamp. He pulled out a blank envelope, slid it across the surface, and reached for his pen. He didn't sign the papers. He didn't even touch them. Instead, he signed his name neatly across the blank envelope, slow, deliberate, final. Then he folded the investment documents, placed them inside, and sealed it shut. For a long moment, he stared at it, his thumb pressing against the crease. "Lesson before legacy," he whispered to the empty room. The clock ticked quietly behind him, each second stretching like breath. In the reflection of the window, he could see his own face, older, sharper, clear with purpose. He placed the envelope in his briefcase and turned off the lamp. The next morning, when Luke asked how the review was going, Arthur smiled faintly. "Almost done," he said. But inside, the decision was already made. He wouldn't confront his son, not yet. He would teach him. That night, Arthur couldn't sleep. The documents still sat in his briefcase, sealed away, but their weight pressed against him like a confession. He'd booked himself a room at a small hotel near the edge of town, neutral ground, away from Luke's house, away from the rehearsed warmth that no longer fooled him. The heater rattled softly in the corner, the wallpaper faded, but the quiet felt honest. He sat at the desk by the window, a cup of lukewarm coffee untouched beside him. Snow drifted against the glass, soft and endless. And somewhere in that pale reflection, a younger version of himself looked back, one from the night everything had broken. He remembered it clearly. The argument had started in the kitchen, over bills and loans, over Luke's dream that had started to look more like a gamble than a plan. Arthur had mortgaged part of the house to fund his son's first venture. When the numbers didn't add up, when suppliers called asking for payment, Arthur had tried to intervene. "Dad, you don't understand business," Luke had snapped, pacing the floor. "You've spent your life fixing chairs and cabinets. You think that's the same as running a company?" Arthur's voice had cracked with both pride and frustration. "I understand work, I understand responsibility, and I understand when a man's letting ambition blind him." Luke's eyes had burned, the same green as his mother's, but colder. "You just can't stand that I'm trying to be more than you." The silence that followed had been worse than shouting. Arthur had turned away first. "I was trying to help you, Luke." "No," Luke said, his voice breaking. "You were trying to control me." Then came the slamming of the door, the roar of the car engine, and the taillights vanishing down the snowy road. Pride kept Arthur from chasing him. He'd told himself Luke needed space, that the boy would come back once he saw reason. But he never did. Weeks later, Arthur's wife had fallen ill again. The cancer they thought was gone had returned, fast and merciless. She asked about Luke every day, her voice fading with each question. "Have you heard from him?" "He'll come, won't he?" Arthur lied each time. "He will." She died before Luke ever returned. At the funeral, Arthur left a chair empty beside him. He'd hoped, desperately, that Luke would appear, even at the last minute. But the only sound that filled the church was rain against the stained glass windows. He'd buried his wife with both their hearts, unfinished. Now, sitting in the hotel decades later, Arthur felt the same dull ache under his ribs. Time hadn't healed it. It had only made it quieter, more private. He pulled a photo from his wallet, his wife smiling, Luke as a boy holding a wooden plane they'd built together. The photo was creased, the colors fading, but the love inside it still hurt to look at. He wiped at his eyes, angry at himself for still caring so much. He'd forgiven Luke 100 times in silence, rebuilt excuses for him the way he once rebuilt broken furniture. But tonight, something different stirred beneath the sorrow. Clarity. He thought of the man Luke had become, of Molly's rehearsed smiles, of the way Luke's office walls displayed a version of history that had erased him completely. Maybe greed hadn't replaced grief in Luke's heart. It had grown from it, feeding on guilt that had nowhere else to go. Arthur placed the photo flat on the desk and stared at it for a long while. The man who'd once waited for his son's apology was gone. The man sitting here now wanted truth, nothing more, nothing less. He folded the photo gently, slid it back into his wallet, and took a long, steady breath. "Enough pretending," he murmured to the room. "It's time to see him for who he is." Outside, the snow fell thicker, muting the world in white. The heater clicked off, and the room settled into silence. Arthur leaned back in his chair, eyes open, heart steady. He didn't know what the coming days would bring, only that when they did, he would meet them without illusions. Christmas morning arrived soft and quiet, the kind of cold that silenced even the birds. Snow lay untouched across Luke's perfect yard, and sunlight slipped through the kitchen windows in pale ribbons. The house smelled of cinnamon and polished wood, expensive coffee brewing somewhere down the hall. Arthur woke early, as he always did, long before anyone else stirred. He sat at the edge of the guest bed, hands resting on the small wrapped box sitting beside him. The paper was simple, old-fashioned, brown paper tied with a red ribbon he'd found at the bottom of a drawer back home. Inside was a single object, the set of keys to his old Ford pickup. He stared at the gift for a long moment, thumb brushing against the edge of the ribbon. The truck had been with him through decades. Every job, every road trip, every argument, every reconciliation that never came. It wasn't worth much in money, but in meaning, it held everything. He'd fixed it after his wife passed, kept it running like a relic of his old life. Giving it to Luke felt like handing over a piece of his own past, a symbolic bridge, small but honest. When the house finally came alive, he heard the thud of footsteps upstairs, laughter from the grandkids, the clinking of breakfast dishes. Molly greeted him politely at the dining table, already immaculate in a red sweater dress. Luke appeared last, holding a mug of coffee, his smile wide and practiced. "Merry Christmas, Dad," he said, patting Arthur's shoulder. "Merry Christmas," Arthur replied quietly, sliding the small box toward him. "This is for you." Luke blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of the gift. "Oh, you didn't have to." "I wanted to." Everyone gathered around as Luke tore through the paper, revealing the small set of metal keys resting inside. For a moment, confusion flickered in his eyes. "Dad, are these—" Arthur nodded. "The truck, it's yours now." Luke forced a chuckle, trying to find the right tone. "Dad, that old thing still runs?" Arthur smiled faintly. "She's got a few miles left. Built better than most new ones, if you take care of her." Molly leaned over Luke's shoulder, her voice gentle but dismissive. "That's sweet, Arthur. Very sentimental." Luke turned the keys in his palm, still smiling, though the corners of his mouth twitched with restrained irritation. Gratitude didn't come easily when the gift wasn't what he'd hoped for. He looked up, masking impatience behind politeness. "Thanks, Dad, really. I'll, find her a good spot in the garage." Arthur nodded, his gaze calm, steady. "You should drive her sometime. She's a good reminder of where things start." The comment lingered just a second too long. Luke gave a quick laugh to diffuse it, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly. Arthur noticed every flicker, the forced smile, the restless shift in his chair, the way his eyes darted toward Molly, as if asking whether the gesture mattered. It didn't, not to them. But it did to Arthur. It told him everything he needed to know. The rest of the morning unfolded in the usual choreography of modern holidays. Photos for social media, kids unwrapping gadgets, Molly directing every detail with perfect precision. Arthur participated, smiling when expected, quiet when forgotten. But his eyes stayed on Luke, studying him with the patience of a craftsman inspecting a piece of flawed wood. Later, After the wrapping paper had settled into a pile of color and the coffee cups were half empty, Luke approached him by the window. "Hey, Dad," he said casually, voice low so the others wouldn't hear. "That gift earlier, it means a lot. And about that other thing we were talking about, the investment. When do you think you'll be ready to formalize everything?" Arthur didn't turn. He watched the snow fall instead, each flake dissolving against the window pane. "After Christmas," he said softly. Luke nodded, quick and eager. "Perfect. We'll get everything drafted then. No rush." Arthur finally faced him. "No rush," he echoed. But in his eyes, there was something different now, calm, resolute, unblinking. Luke smiled again, patted his shoulder, and walked away to join Molly. Their voices faded into the hum of laughter and background music. Arthur stayed by the window, the faint reflection of the snow flickering across his face. His reflection stared back at him, older, wiser, tired, but clear. He reached into his pocket and touched the photograph he kept folded there, his wife, smiling beside the same truck, now sitting in Luke's garage. "After Christmas," he whispered again, this time to her. The snow outside thickened, covering everything in white silence. And somewhere beneath that quiet, a clock had started ticking, a countdown, invisible, but certain. The morning after Christmas dawned gray and heavy. The storm had passed, leaving behind snowdrifts that gleamed beneath a muted sky. Arthur woke early, as he always did, and packed his bag in silence. Luke and Molly were still asleep upstairs, their expensive home hushed and still. The only sound, the faint hum of the central heat. He scribbled a short note and left it on the kitchen counter. "Running a few errands. Be back before dinner." Then he stepped out into the cold. The drive to town was long enough for his thoughts to settle into shape. The betrayal no longer burned. It had cooled into something sharper, something that cut with precision rather than fury. He knew what he had to do. By the time he reached the small office downtown, the snow on his boots had melted into puddles on the tile. The brass plaque beside the frosted glass door read, "Harper and Finch Financial Advisors." He'd been here before, years ago, back when the inheritance had first come in. It was a place of quiet confidence, the kind of building where money whispered rather than shouted. Inside, his advisor, David Harper, a man in his 50s with kind eyes and an accountant's calm, rose from behind the desk. "Arthur," he greeted warmly. "It's been a while. How have you been holding up?" Arthur smiled faintly. "Better now that I'm here." David gestured for him to sit. "I assume this isn't a social visit." Arthur placed a folder on the desk. "I need to make some changes." Quietly. David adjusted his glasses and flipped open the folder. "Changes to the trust?" "More than that," Arthur said. "I want to move the majority of my assets, everything tied to my inheritance, into a new trust. This one," he paused, voice softening, "under my wife's name, Elizabeth Hayes Foundation. It'll support community scholarships, apprenticeships, something real, something she would have believed in." David nodded slowly, his expression unreadable but respectful. "And your current accounts? How much access do you want to retain?" Arthur leaned back in his chair. "Just enough for living expenses, and," he added after a moment, "a modest account in Luke's name. Nothing extravagant. Enough that he won't suspect anything's changed." David tilted his head, studying him. "You're sure about this? It's a permanent transfer. Once the foundation's formalized, those funds are beyond anyone's claim, including family." "That's the point," Arthur replied. His voice was calm, almost serene. "This isn't punishment, David. It's clarity." For the next hour, they worked through the details, signatures, authorizations, notarized forms. Each paper Arthur signed felt lighter than the last, as if he were slowly unburdening himself of the weight his son had tried to place on him. When David finally slid the last document across the table, he hesitated. "You know," he said carefully, Most people who come in here to set up something like this, they're acting out of anger. But you seem... He searched for the word. Peaceful. Arthur smiled faintly, eyes on the signature line. Anger is for people still hoping to be understood. He signed, the pen gliding smoothly over the paper. I'm just setting the story straight. David watched him for a moment, then nodded, genuine admiration in his tone. Wise move, sir. Arthur gathered the documents, neatly stacking them back into the folder. Wisdom comes late for some of us, he said quietly. When they finished, Arthur handed a duplicate set of records to his lawyer, whose office was just across the street. Sarah Kent, a woman who'd handled his affairs for years, raised an eyebrow as she flipped through the pages. You're protecting yourself, she said, impressed, and doing it with dignity. That's rare. Arthur smiled. No one needs to get hurt, Sarah. Not financially, anyway. As he stepped back into the cold afternoon air, the town around him looked different, cleaner somehow. The snow shimmered against the rooftops, and the weight on his shoulders eased. He'd spent years waiting for an apology that would never come. Now, he didn't need one. The trap he'd set wasn't meant to ruin his son. It was meant to reveal him. Back in his truck, Arthur sat for a moment, gloved hands resting on the steering wheel. He could almost hear Elizabeth's voice in the quiet, soft, and approving. You finally did it right, Art. He started the engine, the old motor rumbling to life. As he pulled out onto the road, the clouds began to thin, revealing a hint of pale sunlight over the snow. The road ahead was clear now, but the drive home, back to Luke, would be the real test. The morning after Arthur's quiet visit to the bank began like any other. On the surface, at least. The kitchen filled with the clatter of dishes, the smell of butter and toast, the hum of an expensive coffee machine. But beneath the domestic calm, something had shifted. The air carried an edge, a tightness that clung to every movement, every glance. Molly was the first to break the rhythm. She moved briskly between counter and table, her every gesture sharp, purposeful. You know, Luke, she said, voice low but firm, the holidays are almost over. If your father's serious about this investment, the paperwork should be finalized soon. These things take time. Luke looked up from his phone, eyes narrowing slightly. He said, after Christmas? Molly's reply came quick, almost snapping. Yes, but you know how people are, older people especially. They say, after Christmas, and then it becomes after New Year's, then after tax season. Arthur entered then, slower, calm as ever. His movements were deliberate, unbothered. Morning, he said, taking his seat. Morning, Dad, Luke replied, smiling too brightly. We were just talking about the expansion, remember? The one we're partnering on? Arthur spread jam over his toast, the knife scraping gently against the bread. Luke leaned forward. The deal, the investment. You said you'd look over the paperwork. Arthur looked up, eyes mild. Did I? Molly stilled for a fraction of a second. Luke's smile faltered. Yes, he said, his tone tightening. You asked me for the documents. We talked about it before Christmas Eve. Arthur tilted his head, expression thoughtful. Oh, right. Remind me again. What was it for? The question landed like a dropped plate. Luke blinked, momentarily speechless. What was it for? Dad, it's for the expansion. Hayes & Code's going national, the one we've been discussing for days. Arthur nodded slowly. Ah, yes. National expansion. He took a sip of his coffee. Forgive me. I'm getting old. You know how it is. The details slip away sometimes. The grandchildren, Evan and Lila, sat quietly at the far end of the table, spoons clinking softly in their cereal bowls. Their eyes darted between the adults, sensing the rising temperature. Molly folded her napkin, voice tight but polite. Arthur, I think what Luke means is that this is a family opportunity. Your investment would help the business scale faster. New offices, new markets. It's the smart thing to do. Arthur's tone was mild. Shares and all that? She nodded quickly. Exactly, shares. Luke shot her a warning glance, his jaw tightening. She caught it too late. Shares, Arthur repeated softly, setting his coffee cup down with a faint clink. I see. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. The air seemed to thicken around the table. Luke's charm slipped like a mask, losing its glue. Dad, he said more sharply now, I just don't want you to miss out on something great. You've always been practical, but sometimes too cautious. This is about growth, about family legacy. Arthur smiled faintly, eyes still gentle. Family legacy, he echoed. That's a fine phrase, son. Luke pushed his chair back slightly, frustration flickering through his polished composure. Look, I'm trying to include you, all right? I'm offering you something good here. Arthur looked at him evenly. Are you? The words were quiet, almost kind, but they cut deeper than anger could have. Luke's face hardened. What's that supposed to mean? Arthur didn't answer. He buttered another slice of toast instead, each movement slow, deliberate. His silence filled the space where accusation might have lived. Across the table, Molly shifted uncomfortably, sensing the ground beneath them starting to crack. She reached for her water glass. Maybe we should talk about this later, she said softly. Luke glared at her again, his patience unraveling thread by thread. No. We'll talk about it now. Dad, you said you were on board. I told my team to start preparing. You can't just... Arthur raised a hand gently, stopping him mid-sentence. Luke, he said calmly, why don't we enjoy breakfast? We can deal with business later. After Christmas, remember? Luke opened his mouth, then closed it. The restraint cost him visible effort. His knuckles whitened around the handle of his coffee mug. Evan and Lila exchanged a glance, then quietly excused themselves, plates in hand. The sound of their footsteps up the stairs left an aching hush in their wake. Molly broke it first. They can tell, she murmured, not meeting Luke's eyes. The tension, they can feel it. Luke leaned back, exhaling sharply. I'm trying to build something for them, for all of us. Why can't you just trust that? Arthur stood, folding his napkin neatly. Trust, he said softly, isn't built on signatures. Luke stared at him, eyes narrowing with a flicker of uncertainty. What does that mean? Arthur offered a small smile. You'll understand soon enough. Then he left the room, his footsteps steady, unhurried. Behind him, silence settled again. Thick, uncomfortable, full of things unspoken. Molly stared down at her untouched plate, the color draining from her face. Luke, she said finally, her voice low, what if this isn't going the way you think? Luke didn't answer. He just stared at the empty doorway where his father had stood, jaw clenched, thoughts spinning faster than he could contain. Upstairs, the sound of the children's voices floated faintly down the hall, soft, distant, safe from whatever had just shifted below. And in that quiet kitchen, with the morning light slanting across the table, Molly finally saw it. The smallest fracture in their perfect plan. The first crack, spreading just wide enough to let the truth start slipping through. The sky was a pale gray when Arthur pulled up to the small cottage on Willow Lane. The snow had stopped, but frost still clung to the branches, glimmering faintly under the weak winter sun. He hadn't been here in years, not since the early days of Luke's first business, when everything still felt like hope instead of history. He parked his old pickup in front of the house and took a slow breath before stepping out. The sound of gravel crunching beneath his boots carried in the cold air. The porch light was already on, even though it was midday. Arthur Hayes, a warm voice called as he reached the door. Well, I'll be damned. I thought you'd moved away years ago. It was Marjorie Langley, his old neighbor, her silver hair tied back, eyes still sharp with kindness. She opened the door wide, ushering him in before he could speak. The smell of freshly baked bread filled the cozy little home. Come in, she said. You must be freezing. Sit down, I'll make us some tea. Arthur smiled softly, taking a seat near the window, where a small radio hummed faint Christmas tunes. Everything about this house felt real, lived in, imperfect, warm. I was in the neighborhood, he said, though both of them knew that wasn't true. Marjorie poured tea into mismatched cups, her hands steady despite age. I saw your name in the paper a few weeks ago, she said, settling across from him. The donation for the library. That was a beautiful thing to do, Arthur. Liz would have been proud. He nodded, eyes drifting to the window. She would have liked to see it rebuilt. Marjorie studied him for a moment. And Luke? Does he help you with these things now? Arthur hesitated. He's involved in his own work. You've probably heard about his company. Her expression softened, lines deepening with memory. Oh, I remember that company. I remember when it was just an idea. She leaned back, smiling faintly. You sold your truck to help him get started. You remember that? Arthur froze. Of course I remember. She chuckled softly. You were out there polishing it one last time before the buyer came. Liz stood beside you, crying like you were burying a friend, and you said, it's for Luke. He's going to build something better than wheels. Arthur's throat tightened. The memory came back clear, the smell of motor oil, the ache in his hands as he handed over the keys, the way Luke had hugged him that night, promising he'd pay him back 100-fold. Marjorie's eyes dimmed slightly as she looked toward the window. Funny thing, though, I ran into his wife at the grocery store last spring. Lovely woman, very polished. She mentioned Luke started his company from scratch, with nothing but grit and faith. She paused, her tone gentle. He never told his kids that you sold that truck, did he? Arthur's lips parted, but no words came. He shook his head slowly. No, he said finally. He didn't. Marjorie sighed, her voice carrying both affection and quiet reproach. You always were too proud to remind people what you did for them. But I remember, Arthur. Some of us do. He smiled faintly, though the warmth didn't reach his eyes. That's enough, he said, someone remembering. They sat in silence for a while, the ticking of an old wall clock marking time between them. When he stood to leave, Marjorie followed him to the door, her hand brushing his arm. You were a good father, Arthur. Don't let anyone rewrite that. He nodded, his throat thick. Thank you, Marjorie, for the tea and for the truth. As he drove away, her words stayed with him. The wind whistled faintly through the cracks in the truck's windows, carrying ghosts of years gone by. Pride and sadness twisted together in his chest until he couldn't tell which was heavier. He thought about Luke's polished life, the company built on the illusion of self-made success, the children who had no idea what sacrifices paved their father's empire. By the time he reached the edge of town, the decision had already taken root. If Luke wanted to live in a story without him, Arthur would write his own chapter, one that couldn't be erased. He pulled into the parking lot of the Maple Grove Chronicle, the same small paper that had once printed his library donation story. Inside, the front desk clerk looked up from her screen. Morning, sir. How can I help you? Arthur placed his wallet on the counter, voice steady. I'd like to buy an ad space for the weekend edition. Sure, she said, sliding a form toward him. What would you like it to say? Arthur took the pen, his handwriting slow but certain. When he finished, he slid the form back. The clerk read it silently, her eyebrows lifting slightly. For my son, who forgot who built the bridge. Arthur smiled, his eyes tired but sure. Make it the first page of the community section. She nodded. Of course. As he walked back to his truck, the cold air bit at his face, but for the first time in years, his heart felt steady. He wasn't seeking revenge. He was telling the truth. And truth, he thought, could build or burn a bridge just the same. The newspaper hit doorsteps across Maple Grove just after dawn on Christmas Eve. The sky was the color of pewter, snow falling in lazy, heavy flakes, and every porch on the street seemed to glow faintly under its weight. By 8 o'clock, the story had already started moving. It wasn't front-page news, not really. Just a small, half-column ad, tucked neatly into the community section of the Maple Grove Chronicle. But the headline was impossible to ignore. For my son, who forgot who built the bridge, there was no name beneath it. No logo, no date, no company. Just those 10 words and a simple black and white photo of an old wooden bridge, the same one Luke's first business had been named after years ago. People noticed. People talked. By noon, the whispers had turned into a low hum across town. At the diner, June folded the paper and said softly, "That's Arthur's handwriting if I've ever seen it." At the hardware store, old men nodded knowingly. "He built that bridge, didn't he? Sold his truck for the boys' company." Everywhere the story traveled, the same conclusion formed like frost on glass. Arthur Hayes had written the ad, and Luke Hayes, the self-made man, the local success story, was the son who had forgotten. By afternoon, Luke's phone was vibrating nonstop. Friends, clients, investors, all of them asking questions wrapped in politeness. "Hey, saw something strange in the paper. Everything okay with your dad?" "That bridge ad, kind of poetic, huh?" Luke's replies grew shorter each time. "Yeah, fine. He's just being sentimental. Don't read into it." But by evening, the tone of the calls shifted. A sponsor withdrew a pending deal. A local reporter left a voicemail asking for comment. The perfect image of Luke Hayes, the grateful son, the town's pride, had been smudged in a single morning. When Arthur came downstairs to pack his small travel bag, the storm inside the house had already begun. Molly was pacing near the kitchen island, her phone in hand. "It's everywhere, Luke," she hissed. "Everyone's seen it. Do you realize how this makes us look? It's humiliating." Luke's voice boomed from the living room. "You think I don't know that? I'm handling it." "Handling it?" she snapped. "You're the one who's supposed to control narratives, remember? Isn't that what you tell everyone? That you build stories, brands, reputations?" She turned sharply as Arthur stepped into the doorway. "Why would you do that?" Arthur's expression was calm, almost peaceful. "Do what?" Molly held up her phone, the newspaper ad glowing on the screen. "This. You humiliated him. You humiliated all of us." Arthur met her gaze evenly. "I didn't name anyone." Luke appeared behind her, his jaw tight, eyes blazing. "Don't play games, Dad. Everyone knows what you meant." Arthur picked up his coat from the chair. "Then maybe they know more truth than I thought." Luke took a step closer, voice rising. "You think you can just embarrass me in public and walk away like nothing happened? You think this fixes anything?" Arthur stopped, then turned, his tone even. "I didn't write it to fix anything. I wrote it to stop lying." The words landed with the weight of a hammer. Molly folded her arms, fury masking fear. "You've ruined his reputation. Do you know what that costs in our world?" Arthur smiled faintly. "Reputation's a funny thing. It only falls apart when there's something hollow inside." Luke's hands clenched into fists at his sides. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint whistle of wind outside. Arthur looked around the house one last time. The gleaming countertops, the curated art, the family photos that didn't include him. "You've built yourself a fine life here," he said softly. "I just wanted to remind you what it was built on." Then he lifted his bag and walked toward the front door. "Where are you going?" Luke demanded. Arthur turned the knob. "Out of your way." The cold air swept in as he stepped outside, snow swirling against his coat. He didn't look back. That night, he checked into the small inn near the edge of town, the same one he'd stayed in years ago after his wife's funeral. The room hadn't changed much. Floral curtains, a single lamp, a bedspread patterned with forget-me-nots. He dropped his bag on the floor and sat at the small wooden desk, listening to the storm rage against the window. His phone stayed silent on the nightstand. No calls, no messages. Not from Luke, not from Molly, not even from the grandkids. For the first time in years, the quiet didn't ache. It simply was. He looked out through the frosted glass at the snow drifting down, thick and endless. It looked like peace. Or maybe just the closest thing to it a man like him could earn. For decades, Arthur had tried to hold his family together through patience, through forgiveness, through pretending. But tonight, for the first time, he'd chosen honesty over harmony. He'd stopped pretending that love could survive as currency. He poured himself a glass of water, raised it slightly toward the window's reflection, and murmured, "Merry Christmas, Liz." Outside, the wind softened, and the world fell back into stillness. He exhaled, slow and deep, and for the first time in a long time, his chest didn't hurt. There was sorrow, yes, but beneath it, something faint and new began to flicker. It wasn't victory, it wasn't revenge, it was peace, quiet, fragile, hard-won peace. And though the snow would melt come morning, Arthur knew this silence, this truth, would stay. The knock came just after sunrise, sharp and unrelenting against the thin motel door. Arthur was already awake, sitting at the small desk, watching the last flakes of snow drift past the window. He didn't move at first. He didn't need to. He knew that knock. "Open the door, Dad!" Luke's voice, loud, shaking, not from the cold, but from fury barely contained. Arthur stood slowly, taking his time, and opened the door. Luke pushed inside, his face red from the wind and something deeper. "You humiliated me," he spat. "On Christmas, you couldn't just talk to me like a man. You had to put it in the paper." Arthur closed the door behind him, quiet as snowfall. "Good morning, son," he said evenly. Luke's hands trembled at his sides. "Do you have any idea what that stunt did? The phones won't stop ringing. Clients, partners, they think I'm some ungrateful fraud." Arthur looked at him, eyes calm, unblinking. "And are you?" Luke froze, words faltering. "That's not the point." Arthur's tone didn't rise, didn't crack. "It's exactly the point." For a moment, neither spoke. The heater hummed weakly in the background, filling the silence that swelled between them. "You humiliated me," Luke repeated, but softer now, less accusation, more confession. Arthur's response came like a steady hand. "No, Luke, I reminded you." The words hit harder than anger could have. Luke's shoulders dropped, the fight draining from his expression. "You think that ad makes you some kind of saint? You think it fixes what's broken?" Arthur shook his head. "No, I think it names what's broken. That's all." Behind Luke, the hallway creaked, and Molly appeared in the doorway. Wrapped in her coat, face pale. She didn't say a word, just stood there, watching, her eyes darting between them. Arthur glanced her way, nodding politely. "Molly." She gave the faintest nod in return, but didn't step inside. Her silence said enough. Luke ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small room. "You don't understand how this works anymore, Dad. Perception is reality. You make me look weak, and everything I've built falls apart." Arthur turned toward the desk, opened his briefcase, and took out a neatly folded envelope. He held it up between two fingers. "You mean this?" Luke blinked. "What is that?" "The investment papers," Arthur said simply. "The ones you drafted for me to sign." Luke hesitated. You looked them over?" "I did." Arthur extended the envelope, the flap still sealed, his name signed neatly across the front. "You forgot to include one detail, though." Luke's brow furrowed. "What detail?" "That the man you were trying to outsmart taught you everything you know about integrity." Luke flinched just slightly. Arthur stepped closer, his voice steady, but not cruel. "You can't lose what was never given, Luke." He placed the envelope in his son's hand. Luke looked down at it, confusion and shame flickering through his face like lightning across glass. Arthur picked up his coat from the chair and slipped it on. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a man closing a final chapter. "Where are you going?" Luke asked, voice low, almost boyish now. Arthur met his eyes. "Home." Luke took a step forward, words stumbling out. "Dad, wait." But Arthur didn't. He opened the door, the cold wind rushing in, swirling the curtains. Molly stepped aside as he passed, her expression caught somewhere between guilt and understanding. For a second, she almost spoke, but no words came. Arthur paused in the doorway, looking back just once. "You'll figure it out one day," he said quietly. "I hope it's soon." Then he walked into the morning light. Behind him, Luke stood motionless, staring at the envelope still warm from his father's hand. Molly finally broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "What did he mean?" Luke didn't answer. His jaw tightened, eyes fixed on the signature across the paper. Bold, final, untouched. Outside, the snow had stopped, but the air carried the chill of reckoning. And as Arthur's footsteps faded down the path, the silence he left behind felt heavier than any storm. The new year arrived with ice in the air and whispers on every corner. By the first week of January, Maple Grove no longer spoke of Christmas decorations or snowfall. They spoke of the ad. The small message that had started as a riddle had now become a mirror, reflecting something the town hadn't wanted to see. Luke Hayes, once the golden son of Maple Grove, was now the subject of murmured conversations over coffee counters and office cubicles. "Did you hear about Arthur's ad?" someone would say. "The bridge story. Turns out he's the reason Luke's business ever existed." "Self-made, huh?" another would reply. "Funny how stories change when truth shows up." The gossip spread like frost across windows, quiet, persistent, impossible to stop. Within 2 weeks, 2 of Luke's investors paused their funding. Another postponed a meeting indefinitely. His assistant quit, politely citing personal reasons. And at the local Chamber of Commerce, a speaker introduced him as the man who built the bridge, before pausing awkwardly, realizing the irony mid-sentence. Molly watched it all unravel with the precision of someone who understood reputation better than morality. Her smiles tightened, her voice, once honeyed, turned brittle. One afternoon, when reporters began calling the house for comment, she did what she knew best. She shifted the blame. "It's his father," she said to a neighbor, her voice trembling just enough to sound wounded. "Arthur never could stand Luke's success. This stunt of his, it's jealousy, pure and simple." Her version spread almost as quickly as the truth. Some people believed her, some didn't, but it didn't matter. The stain had already set. Arthur, meanwhile, stayed quiet. He didn't answer questions when people stopped him in town. He didn't correct the gossip or defend himself. He just returned to his workshop, hands steady, sanding a piece of oak until it gleamed like memory. Truth, he knew, didn't need defending. It only needed time. The days grew colder, but something inside him had thawed. For the first time in years, he wasn't trying to fix what was broken. He was simply letting truth do its slow work. Then, one evening, just after sunset, there came a soft knock at his workshop door. Arthur looked up from his bench. Through the frosted glass, he saw a small, hesitant shadow. He opened the door and found Rebecca, Luke's daughter, standing there, bundled in her coat, cheeks red from the cold. "Grandpa," she whispered. Arthur blinked in surprise, then smiled gently. "Rebecca, what are you doing out here?" "It's freezing." She stepped inside, rubbing her gloved hands together. "Mom doesn't know I'm here. Dad either. I needed to see you." Arthur poured her a mug of cocoa, using the same dented pot his wife once used for Luke. They sat across from each other, the small workshop filled with the scent of wood and warmth. After a long silence, Rebecca finally spoke. Dad's scared. Arthur looked up. Scared? She nodded, eyes glistening. He doesn't say it, but I can tell. He's not sleeping. He yells at Mom. He keeps pacing, checking his phone. He says he might lose everything. Arthur's voice was gentle but steady. Fear does that sometimes. Rebecca looked at him, confusion softening her young face. Do you hate him for what he did? Arthur smiled faintly, setting his cup down. Hate's too heavy to carry at my age. And it doesn't fix anything. He leaned forward, his voice a quiet lesson, more than an answer. Fear sometimes teaches what love couldn't. She frowned slightly. You mean, this will make him better? Arthur's eyes glimmered with the faint reflection of the workshop lamp. It might. Or it might break him first. That's the thing about lessons. You don't get to choose the order. Rebecca nodded slowly, staring into her cocoa, processing more than her young heart could fully understand. When she finally stood to leave, Arthur walked her to the door. Tell your dad, he said softly, that the bridge is still standing, even if he forgot who built it. Rebecca looked up at him, eyes filled with something between admiration and sorrow. I will. Arthur smiled. Be kind to him, even when he's wrong. It's harder than it sounds. She hugged him tightly, then disappeared into the falling snow. Arthur stood in the doorway for a long while after she was gone. The air was cold, sharp, alive. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang faintly, echoing through the valley. He turned back to his workbench, the small lamp casting long shadows across the floor. The tools gleamed, waiting. Outside, the town kept talking, whispers of scandal, sympathy, and speculation. But Arthur didn't listen. The truth was already doing what it was meant to do, and as he brushed the last bit of sawdust from the wood, he allowed himself a small, quiet thought, one he hadn't felt in years. Maybe, just maybe, the cracks spreading through Luke's life weren't destruction. Maybe they were the start of light finding its way in. The knock came again, but softer this time. It was a gray morning, the kind of gray that seemed to press against the windows rather than light them. Arthur was at his workbench, sanding the edge of a chair leg, when he heard it. 3 slow taps, hesitant, familiar. He set the sandpaper aside and wiped his hands on a rag. When he opened the door, Luke stood there, not the man he remembered from the glossy photos and pressed suits, but someone smaller, frayed around the edges. His coat hung loosely from his shoulders, his eyes ringed in sleepless shadows. Dad, Luke said quietly. Arthur studied him for a long moment. You look tired. I am, Luke admitted, stepping inside. The smell of sawdust and varnish filled the room, grounding him in a world he'd left behind. He looked around, as if seeing it for the first time. I lost clients, Dad. Half of them walked out this week. Said they didn't want to be associated with a dishonest brand. He laughed dryly. That's what they called me. A brand. Arthur turned back to his bench, his tone steady. You didn't lose them because of a newspaper ad. Luke's voice cracked with frustration. Then what was it? Arthur looked over his shoulder. You lost honesty first. The words landed like a quiet hammer strike, firm, unyielding. Luke exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his hair. You think I meant for this to happen? You think I don't care about what people say? Arthur didn't answer right away. He went back to sanding, each motion deliberate, patient. I think you cared more about what people thought than what was true. Luke's voice rose. That's easy for you to say. You've never had to build something from nothing. Arthur turned then, eyes sharp but calm. Nothing? You think you built that company from nothing? You think hard work only started when I stopped funding you? Luke's mouth opened, but no words came. Arthur stepped closer. I mortgaged our home to give you your start. Your mother sold her jewelry. You drove her to chemo appointments in the truck I sold to keep your business alive. And when it all finally took off, You rewrote history like we were footnotes. Luke's breath trembled. I didn't mean to erase you. Arthur's tone softened, though his words stayed firm. You didn't erase me, Luke. You erased yourself, the version of you that still knew gratitude. Luke took a shaky breath, anger and shame wrestling behind his eyes. I thought if I looked strong enough, people would respect me. Investors, clients, they don't back men with debts or messy families. They want a story. Arthur nodded. And you gave them one. You just forgot it wasn't real. For a long moment, the only sound was the faint ticking of the clock above the window. Luke sat down on the old stool near the wall, the same one he'd sat on as a boy, watching his father build things that lasted longer than people's attention spans. His voice broke. I ruined everything, didn't I? Arthur sighed, setting his tools down. No, you just told the wrong story too long. Luke's head dropped into his hands. His shoulders shook once, then again. Years of pride crumbled under the weight of that quiet workshop, the place where truth didn't need raising voices to be heard. The sobs came rough and unguarded, the kind of sound that only escapes when a man finally stops pretending. Arthur moved toward him, slow but sure. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder, the gesture steady, unhesitating. You've carried a lot of lies, Luke. It's heavy, isn't it? Luke nodded, his voice muffled. I don't know how to fix it. Arthur knelt beside him, their faces level for the first time in years. You start the same way you build anything that matters, he said softly. You tell the truth, one piece at a time. Luke looked up, eyes wet, voice cracking. I'm sorry, Dad. I really am. Arthur's expression softened with something deeper than forgiveness. Understanding. He reached out, pulling Luke into a quiet embrace. The smell of sawdust and winter filled the space between them. For the first time since boyhood, Luke let himself be held, not as a man defending his pride, but as a son remembering what home felt like. Minutes passed before Arthur spoke again, his voice quiet against Luke's shoulder. Now we start over, he said. No checks, no lies. Luke nodded weakly. I don't deserve another chance. Arthur smiled faintly. That's what makes it a chance. When they finally let go, Luke's eyes were red but clearer, his face lighter. He stood, glancing around the workshop, at the half-built chairs and shelves, at the tools lined neatly like soldiers of truth. You really never stopped working, he said softly. Arthur chuckled. Stopped waiting, maybe, but not working. Luke exhaled slowly, a fragile peace settling over him. What do I do now? Arthur picked up the sandpaper again, handing it to him. Start small, he said. There's plenty of wood that needs smoothing. Luke looked down at the sandpaper, then back at his father. For the first time, he didn't see a man he'd outgrown. He saw the foundation he'd forgotten. Outside, the light began to change. Pale morning melting into gold. The snow was starting to thaw. Arthur turned toward the window, his voice almost a whisper. Truth has its own season. Looks like ours just came around again. Luke said nothing. He just stood there, hands trembling slightly as he began to sand alongside his father. The silence between them was no longer cold. It was rebuilding. By the time the new week began, the town's noise had quieted, but not disappeared. Luke had spent days rebuilding in silence, helping his father in the workshop, learning the rhythm of patience again. Yet even as he found comfort in the smell of sawdust and the steady scrape of sandpaper, he knew the storm outside wasn't over. His name was still whispered, his reputation still fractured. One evening, as the winter light began to fade, Luke sat alone at the small workbench near the window. Arthur had already gone upstairs, leaving the workshop in stillness. The only light came from Luke's phone screen, glowing against the wood. His thumb hovered over the new post button. For years, his life had been constructed like a press release, tidy, curated, controlled. every word measured, every truth managed. But now, the urge to speak without strategy, to tell the story unedited, pulsed through him like a heartbeat. He started typing. For years, I've called myself a self-made man. That phrase has been on magazine covers, investor calls, company banners. But it was never true. He paused, the weight of honesty both heavy and freeing. His fingers moved again. My father, Arthur Hayes, is the reason I ever had the chance to build anything. He sold his truck to fund my first business. He gave up security for my dreams, and I repaid him with silence. Luke stopped and stared at the blinking cursor. His throat tightened. The words looked too raw, too human, for a man used to speaking in polished sentences. But he didn't delete them. He continued. I spent years chasing image over truth, thinking success meant being seen instead of being grateful. I forgot that bridges don't build themselves. My father built mine, with sweat, sacrifice, and love I didn't deserve. I'm writing this not to fix my reputation, but to tell the truth, finally. He ended it simply. Dad, if you're reading this, thank you. I hope one day I'll earn your name back. His finger hovered for a moment longer before he hit post. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the notifications began to flood in. Likes, shares, comments stacking in waves. By morning, it had spread far beyond Maple Grove. Old clients, former classmates, townspeople, hundreds of messages poured in. This is what real accountability looks like. Courageous. We need more men like this. The same paper that once printed Arthur's quiet ad now printed Luke's confession, calling it a son's reckoning. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but not everyone applauded. Molly stood in the living room, phone shaking in her hand. You've lost your mind, she hissed, eyes glistening with fury. You just destroyed everything we built. Luke looked up from the couch, calm in a way that unnerved her. No, Molly, I just stopped pretending it was built on truth. She blinked, disbelief turning to contempt. Do you even understand what you've done? Investors will see this as weakness. People will pity you, not respect you. We'll be ruined. He stood slowly. Then maybe we start over. Molly stared at him, realization dawning like something cold and sharp. You're choosing him over me. Luke's voice was quiet but firm. I'm choosing honesty. If that costs me you, then it costs me. She laughed bitterly, the sound brittle and hollow. Good luck rebuilding your life with a workshop and a quote in the local paper. Her footsteps echoed down the hallway. Moments later, a door slammed. Luke stood in the silence she left behind, heart pounding, but lighter than it had felt in years. For once, there was no performance left, just truth standing bare. Meanwhile, across town, Arthur sat at his kitchen table with a mug of coffee and the morning paper. His hands trembled slightly as he read the headline. Beneath it, his son's words, unfiltered, unvarnished, finally honest. He didn't finish the article. He didn't need to. The words blurred halfway down, tears gathering in his eyes. But this time, they didn't sting. They felt clean. He set the paper aside and looked out the window. The snow had begun to melt, trickling off the eaves in slow, steady drips. The world outside glistened like something being washed new. For years, Arthur had thought of wealth as what people left behind. Money, property, inheritance. But this truth, this reconciliation, this small return of dignity, was a different kind of fortune entirely. He leaned back, closing his eyes, a faint smile forming through the tears. You finally got there, kid, he whispered. The sound of melting snow tapped gently against the window pane. The house felt fuller now, the silence no longer empty, but alive. And though the past still lingered, its scars, its weight, something new had begun to breathe in its place. Not money, not pride, just truth. And the quiet wealth that comes when it's finally enough. By the end of spring, the empire Luke Hayes had built finally came apart, Not with explosions or headlines, but with quiet notices and numbers that stopped adding up. Emails went unanswered. Loans were called in. Clients withdrew politely worded statements. One by one, the glossy panels of his life began to peel away, revealing the fragile truth underneath. When the news broke that Hayes and Cohen had filed for bankruptcy, the town didn't celebrate. They just nodded in quiet understanding. Some whispered that pride had finally caught up with him. Others said he was just unlucky. But Arthur knew better. Pride and luck rarely failed together by accident. The mansion went first, then the cars, the stocks, the office furniture. When the bank reclaimed the house, Molly didn't stay for the closing. She'd already moved out weeks before, her silence serving as the final signature on their marriage. Luke ended up in a modest apartment on the edge of town. 2 rooms, 1 lamp, and a view of the parking lot. The walls were bare except for one frame, a photo of his father standing beside the old truck, both of them younger, both smiling without weight behind their eyes. Arthur came by one evening with a grocery bag in his hands, bread, coffee, and a few tools. He didn't ask permission, he just placed them on the counter. "You didn't have to bring that," Luke said, voice quiet but raw. Arthur shrugged, setting the groceries down. "Didn't bring it for you. The coffee's for me." Luke managed a small laugh, the first in days. They sat at the small kitchen table, steam rising from their mugs. The silence between them wasn't the same as before. It wasn't cold anymore. It was simply real. Luke finally spoke, eyes on the floor. "It's strange. Losing everything feels awful, but it's like I can breathe again. No meetings, no press, no pretending." Arthur nodded, sipping his coffee. "Debt's not just money, son. It's the cost of the stories we tell ourselves." Luke looked up, studying his father. "You're not going to say, 'I told you so,' are you?" Arthur smiled faintly. "No, you already know it. Doesn't need repeating." They sat quietly for a while before Arthur's gaze drifted toward the corner of the apartment, where an old, scratched coffee table leaned against the wall. "That yours?" "Was," Luke said. "Bought it years ago when I moved into my first office. It's broken now. I should have thrown it out." Arthur stood, walking over to it. "It's not broken," he said, crouching down. "Just needs attention." Luke frowned. "I don't have the tools." Arthur smiled, holding up the small bag he'd brought. "Good thing I do." That night, they worked side by side in the dim light of a desk lamp. Arthur sanded the edges smooth while Luke held the legs steady, their movements falling into an old rhythm, one that hadn't existed since Luke was a boy. "Hand me that dowel," Arthur said. Luke passed it wordlessly, the wood warm from his hands. The sound of scraping, tightening, and hammering filled the apartment, a symphony of rebuilding, small but profound. As they worked, Arthur spoke softly, almost to himself. "Now you can build something real." Luke looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" Arthur didn't stop sanding. "When you build for pride, you build walls. When you build for truth, you build homes." Luke was silent for a moment, the meaning sinking in like sawdust into old grain. When the table was done, they stood back to look at it. It wasn't perfect. Its edges were uneven, the finish still rough, but it stood steady. Luke ran his fingers along the wood, his voice barely a whisper. "You think it'll last?" Arthur smiled. "If you take care of it." The next morning, the sound of tools returned. Not for business, not for clients, but for something simpler. Repairs, restorations, beginnings. They started bringing in old furniture from the town dump, pieces too worn for others to bother with. Together, they sanded, glued, and polished. Word spread quietly. People began dropping by with broken chairs and splintered frames. Arthur never charged a cent. Luke didn't ask for help. They just worked. The rhythm of wood and steel filled the apartment, replacing years of silence. And though their hands were tired and the money was gone, something better had taken root. Something honest, solid, earned. Outside, the spring air drifted through the open window, carrying the faint sound of their hammers into the street. Inside, two men, father and son, rebuilt not just wood, but themselves. One stroke, one nail, one truth at a time. The apartment was quiet again, but not in the way silence once haunted them. The air felt lighter now, steady, full of small sounds that carried meaning. The soft turning of a page, the scratch of a pen, the faint ticking of a wall clock that hadn't worked in years, but somehow still marked time. Arthur sat by the window, journal open on his lap. The morning light came in, low and gold, washing over the pages like memory itself. His handwriting had grown slower, each letter deliberate, as though he were carving thoughts into wood. Pride has many disguises, he wrote. Some wear suits and speeches. Others wear patience and silence. I've known both. He paused, tapping the pen gently against the edge of the page. For the first time in years, he saw the full picture clearly. Not just Luke's pride, but his own. The nights he refused to call. The months he let hurt fester into distance. The years he allowed his silence to become punishment, mistaking pride for strength. I used to think forgiveness meant letting someone back in, he continued. But maybe it's just the quiet acceptance that both of us were wrong, and both of us are still learning. He closed the journal and leaned back, listening to the faint hum of the city outside. Somewhere below, a truck passed, tires crunching over gravel. The world moved forward, as it always did. There was a soft knock at the door. Luke entered, wiping his hands on a rag. You busy? Arthur smiled faintly. Only with my thoughts. Come in. Luke carried in a tray, 2 mugs of coffee, dark and strong, the way Arthur liked it. You've been at that thing for hours, he said, nodding toward the journal. What are you writing? Arthur glanced down at the book, then back up at his son. Just leaving a record, something for when I'm not around to talk as much. Luke sat across from him, expression unreadable. You planning on going somewhere? Arthur chuckled softly. Eventually. Just not in a rush this time. They drank their coffee in silence until another knock interrupted the moment. This one brisk, professional. Sarah Kent, the family lawyer, stood at the door, clutching a brown folder. She smiled politely as she stepped inside. Mr. Hayes, Luke, hope I'm not interrupting. Arthur waved her in. Not at all. Come, sit. You've got that look that says something's ready for signing. She smiled. You guessed it. The trust is finalized. Arthur nodded slowly, folding his hands in his lap. Elizabeth's name is on it? Yes, Sarah said. The Elizabeth Hayes Foundation, a permanent endowment for community apprenticeships. The funds will go directly to the local trade school, scholarships, tool grants, mentorship programs. You'll be changing lives long after you're gone. Luke listened quietly, eyes down. Sarah pulled out the final documents and placed them on the table. All that's left is your signature, Arthur. He reached for the pen, but before signing, he looked up at Luke. You'll witness it? Luke hesitated for half a second before nodding. Of course. As Arthur signed, his hand trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the weight of closure. The final mark of ink was smooth, final, peaceful. When it was done, Sarah slid the papers toward Luke. He added his signature below as witness, the motion quiet and reverent. When she gathered the documents back into her folder, she looked between them with something like quiet respect. You've built something meaningful here, she said softly. Arthur smiled. Took me a while to learn what meaningful actually means. After she left, the room stayed still for a long moment. Luke stared at the stack of papers, then at his father. You really gave it all away, he said quietly. Arthur shrugged. Didn't give it away. I just gave it back, to the people who'll use it better than I ever could. Luke swallowed hard, eyes wet. You could have kept some of it, for yourself. Arthur's smile was gentle. I've already kept what matters. Luke looked down, his throat tightening. I don't deserve this kind of grace, Dad. Arthur leaned forward, resting a steady hand on his son's arm. Maybe not. But then again, neither did I. Humility's not something you earn. It's something you grow into. Luke blinked, fighting the emotion rising behind his eyes. You're finally rich, you know that? Arthur tilted his head, smiling softly. No, son. You are, in humility. Luke's composure broke then, a small, quiet laugh through tears. He leaned forward, resting his forehead against his father's shoulder, the years of distance collapsing in that single, wordless moment. Arthur let out a long breath, his hand resting on Luke's back. You finally figured out what to build, he whispered, and this time it won't collapse. The clock ticked softly above them. Outside, the day had begun to shift, sunlight spilling through the window, reflecting off the polished tools that lined the walls. Arthur looked out at the light, his expression full, peaceful, proud. The world was still imperfect, so were they. But for the first time, neither of them needed it to be otherwise. And in that quiet, the reflection of two men, father and son, shimmered faintly across the window pane, side by side, bound not by success, but by the long, hard road to forgiveness. By the time spring came to Maple Grove, the snow had long melted into quiet streams that traced the sidewalks like forgotten stories finding their way home. Trees bloomed in shy bursts of green, and the air carried that familiar scent of beginnings, fresh soil, rain, and second chances. Arthur Hayes had grown slower by then, his steps deliberate, but his mind sharp as ever. When Luke insisted that he move in, just for a while, Arthur resisted at first. I don't need looking after, he'd said, but Luke only smiled, a little stubborn, a little tender. It's not about that, Dad. It's about company. So, one mild afternoon in early April, Arthur arrived at Luke's small apartment with 2 suitcases and a toolbox. That was all he needed, his essentials and the tools that had always felt like extensions of his hands. The apartment was modest, bare walls, mismatched furniture, the hum of a leaky faucet. But to Arthur, it was warm, honest. Luke had rearranged things to make room, cleared a shelf for his father's books, fixed a chair near the window for him to read. It was strange at first, sharing space after so many years apart. The rhythms of 2 men, once bound by silence, now finding their way back through shared routine. Mornings became a kind of ritual. Arthur brewed coffee while Luke read the news aloud. The smell of toast filled the air, the sound of chairs scraping tile marking their quiet companionship. They talked little at first, just small things, weather, work, grocery lists. But even those words carried warmth. The language of peace didn't need grand declarations. There were awkward moments, too. Arthur fussing over the stove settings, Luke correcting him gently, Luke offering help with the laundry, Arthur insisting he wasn't helpless. Pride still lingered, but it was softer now, worn smooth by time. One Saturday afternoon, the front door burst open with a cheerful voice. "Grandpa!" Rebecca came bounding in, backpack slung over one shoulder, her laughter bright as sunlight through the window. Arthur's face lit up instantly. "There's my favorite troublemaker," he said, opening his arms. She hugged him tight. "Mom said I could stay for the weekend." Luke, drying his hands with a towel, smiled from the kitchen doorway. "I thought maybe you two could work on something together," he said, gesturing to the small balcony outside. "She's been talking about building a birdhouse for weeks." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "Birdhouse, huh? All right then, apprentice. Let's see what you've got." Rebecca grinned. "I'm ready." They set up a small work table on the balcony, the city hum faint in the distance. Arthur guided her hands as she measured and sawed, patient and gentle, his old carpenter's rhythm returning like music. "Measure twice, cut once," he reminded her. "I know, Grandpa," she said with mock seriousness. Luke leaned against the door frame watching. For the first time in years, he saw his father as she saw him, not as the man he'd disappointed, but as a teacher, patient and steady. The hammer taps echoed softly in the air, the sound blending with birdsong and laughter. Arthur's hands, though slower, were sure. He showed Rebecca how to sand the edges smooth, how to line the nails evenly. Every small instruction carried a lifetime of care. When she made mistakes, he never scolded, just smiled and said, "Wood forgives if you take your time." When the birdhouse was done, she held it proudly. It wasn't perfect. The roof slanted slightly. One nail stuck out too far. But it stood firm. "It's beautiful," Luke said quietly. Arthur smiled. "So is honesty. Doesn't always look even, but it holds." They hung the birdhouse on the small tree outside the building. Rebecca clapped as the wind rocked it gently. "Do you think birds will come?" Arthur nodded. "They always do when you build something with care." Later that evening, the three of them sat around the dinner table, sharing a simple meal. The laughter came easier now. Luke cracked jokes about his disastrous first attempts at carpentry. Arthur teased him about it, and Rebecca laughed until she cried. After dinner, Luke washed the dishes while Arthur dried them. The rhythm was easy, unspoken, each movement a small act of grace. "You know," Luke said quietly without looking up, "I used to think home was something you had to buy." Arthur chuckled. "And now?" Luke smiled faintly. "Now, I think it's something you build, one nail at a time." Arthur set a plate down, the light catching the faint smile on his face. "You finally get it." Rebecca peeked around the corner, giggling. "Get what?" Arthur looked at her, his eyes warm. "That fixing things isn't just about tools. It's about heart." Night settled softly over the apartment. The birdhouse swayed outside in the cool breeze, the streetlights glowing amber. From the balcony, faint chirps already echoed, a curious bird exploring its new home. Arthur sat by the window, notebook open again. He watched Luke and Rebecca laughing over a board game, the kind of simple joy that once felt foreign in his house. He wrote a single line before closing the journal. "The bridges we rebuild are quieter, but stronger." He set the pen down, breathing in the warmth of the room, the laughter, the smell of dinner still lingering, the sound of his family living, not performing. For years, he'd chased peace like a distant dream. Now, here it was, modest, imperfect, entirely real. As Luke turned off the lights, Arthur glanced once more at the birdhouse outside, its shape barely visible in the moonlight. Old wounds didn't close with apologies. They closed like this, with presence, with effort, with love, built piece by piece. And as the night deepened, the house, small, humble, full of life, felt at last like home. It had been almost a year since the ad, the scandal, and the quiet rebuilding that followed. Maple Grove had moved on, mostly. The library Arthur helped rebuild now stood finished, its glass windows gleaming in spring sunlight. Children's laughter echoed inside, and every so often, someone would nod to Arthur in passing with a look of quiet respect. But stories, like seasons, have a way of circling back. One afternoon, a young reporter from the Maple Grove Chronicle called and asked if Arthur would speak with her for an anniversary piece. "We're doing a feature," she explained, "on forgiveness, how families find their way back." Arthur almost declined. He didn't like the attention, didn't believe his private life belonged in print. But something about her voice, earnest, curious, without judgment, made him agree. They met at the workshop, the same one that now doubled as a small community space, its walls lined with photos of apprentices, repaired furniture, and a plaque bearing his late wife's name. The reporter, notebook in hand, looked around, awed. "You built all this after everything?" Arthur smiled faintly. "Not after, because of everything." She scribbled quickly, then asked gently, "Do you mind if we talk about the Christmas ad? People still mention it sometimes." Arthur chuckled softly, shaking his head. "I'm sure they do." She hesitated. "Some say it was revenge. Others call it a message of love. What was it, really?" Arthur thought for a moment before answering. "It was truth," he said finally. "I'd spent too many years pretending things were fine. That ad wasn't to shame my son. It was to stop lying to myself." The reporter nodded slowly, then flipped to a clean page. "And now, a year later, have things healed between you two?" Arthur glanced toward the open doorway where faint laughter drifted in from the living room. Luke and Rebecca sanding a new project together. He smiled. "Healing isn't something that happens all at once. It's not a ceremony. It's just time spent doing small things right." She paused, then looked up, her tone gentle. "Do you forgive him?" Arthur took a deep breath, his gaze lowering to his hands, calloused, steady, honest. For a moment, the question hung in the air like sawdust in light. Then he smiled, the kind that comes from knowing peace, not pretending it. "Forgiveness," he said quietly, "is remembering without poison." The reporter looked up, stunned by the weight of the words. "That's beautiful." Arthur shrugged, eyes twinkling faintly. "It's the only kind that lasts." When the article ran 2 days later, that single line became its heartbeat. People shared it across town, then online, far beyond Maple Grove. Forgiveness is remembering without poison. It spread in quiet waves, quoted by teachers, printed in church bulletins, posted by strangers who'd never met him. The man who once lived in silence had, without meaning to, given voice to something universal. Luke read the article late one night, sitting at the same small table where his father now wrote in his journal each morning. He didn't say a word, just read the line again and again. The words sank deep, washing over the guilt that still lingered in him like an old bruise. He closed his laptop, breathing deeply. The shame didn't vanish, but it softened, finally meeting something stronger. Grace. Back in the workshop, Arthur sat alone, the paper folded neatly beside him. The quote didn't feel profound to him. It was just truth. Simple, lived, earned. He reached for his phone, scrolling through his old voicemail list. There they were, years of missed calls, unreturned messages, small reminders of pride and distance. Luke's voice, younger, sharper. "Dad, call me back." "I didn't mean what I said." "Forget it, it doesn't matter." Messages he could never bring himself to erase, until now. One by one, he deleted them. The sound was soft, small digital clicks, like raindrops against glass. With each one gone, the air in the room seemed to lighten. When the last message disappeared, Arthur set the phone down. Outside, the evening breeze carried the scent of sawdust and lilacs through the open window. He sat for a moment, letting the stillness settle over him, realizing that peace didn't always arrive with grand gestures. It crept in quietly, like forgiveness itself. He smiled, closed his eyes, and whispered to no one in particular, "Finally." And somewhere beyond the workshop walls, life continued, steady, imperfect, whole again. The past hadn't vanished, but it had finally stopped bleeding. It happened on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of day that felt too ordinary to carry bad news. The sun was steady through the workshop windows, and the faint hum of a radio played in the background. Arthur had been sanding the edge of a chair frame, humming along, when his hand suddenly faltered. The world blurred. The sound of wood scraping faded into a low, rushing echo. For a moment, he thought it was just fatigue. He'd skipped lunch, worked too long, but the next moment, his knees gave out. The chair leg fell from his grasp, clattering against the floor as everything tilted into darkness. When Luke heard the crash from the living room, he thought it was just another dropped tool. But when there was no follow-up noise, no muttered "damn it," or sound of his father getting up, Something in him froze. "Dad?" he called out. No answer. He ran into the workshop and found Arthur on the floor, pale, motionless, one hand still clutching a rag. "Dad!" Luke dropped to his knees, shaking him gently. "Come on, stay with me." Arthur's eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "I just lost my balance," he whispered, his voice thin. Luke's chest tightened. "No, you didn't. You're not fine." He grabbed his phone with trembling hands. "I'm calling an ambulance." Arthur weakly shook his head. "Don't make a fuss, Luke. It's just—" "Stop," Luke said sharply, eyes already filling with tears. "You don't get to downplay this. Not anymore." Within minutes, sirens filled the air outside, slicing through the quiet street. The paramedics worked quickly, lifting Arthur onto the stretcher. Luke climbed into the ambulance without asking. He held his father's hand all the way to the hospital, gripping it like an anchor. At the emergency room, the doctors took over. Machines beeped. Voices spoke in quick, clipped tones. Luke stood helplessly in the corner, his mind spinning through every memory, every moment he'd wasted, every word he hadn't said enough. When the doctor finally approached, his expression was calm but serious. "It's heart strain," he said. "He's stable for now, but he needs rest. Real rest. No work, no stress." Luke exhaled shakily, nodding. "Can I see him?" They led him into a quiet room where Arthur lay connected to wires and monitors, the steady rhythm of his heart displayed on a glowing screen. He looked smaller there, framed by white sheets and tubes. But when Luke stepped closer, Arthur's eyes opened, and the faintest smile appeared. "Still here, kid," he murmured. His voice was weak, but his humor was intact. Luke laughed, though it came out broken. "You scared the hell out of me." Arthur blinked slowly. "I told you not to fuss." "Yeah, well," Luke said, sitting beside the bed, "you don't get a vote anymore." That night, Luke refused to leave the hospital. He sat by his father's bedside, the chair pulled close, his hand never far from Arthur's. Nurses came and went, lights dimmed, machines hummed, and through it all, Luke stayed. When Arthur stirred in the small hours of morning, he saw his son slumped over in the chair, asleep, his hand still resting lightly over his own. For years, it had been Arthur who'd watched over a sleeping child, guarding against fever or nightmare. Now, the roles had quietly reversed. He smiled faintly, his eyes glistening with gratitude that went deeper than words. For all his strength, all his control, there was something profoundly humbling about being cared for by the boy he once carried. Over the next few days, Luke managed everything: doctors, medications, even meals. He learned how to help his father walk again, how to time the pills, how to coax him into resting when Arthur's old stubbornness resurfaced. "Dad," Luke said one afternoon, adjusting the blanket on Arthur's lap, "you spent your whole life taking care of everyone else. Let someone return the favor." Arthur looked at him for a long time, his eyes soft. "I never wanted repayment." Luke smiled, his voice barely a whisper. "Then let this just be balance." Arthur chuckled weakly. "Balance. I like that." Days turned into a quiet rhythm of care. The hospital room filled with the scent of fresh flowers from Rebecca and the soft hum of life continuing. For Luke, the nights sitting beside his father's bed became something sacred, a vigil, a penance, and a peace all at once. Each heartbeat on the monitor was a reminder of the debt no money could measure, the debt of love, unspoken, now finally paid in full. One evening, as Arthur drifted into sleep, Luke sat back and watched the gentle rise and fall of his chest. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like the man trying to fix everything. He just felt like a son, grateful for another day. He reached out, brushed a hand across Arthur's wrist, and whispered, "Rest easy, Dad. I've got this now." And for once, he truly did. The first snow of winter came quietly, the kind that fell slow and patient, blanketing Maple Grove in a hush. Inside the small apartment, the air was warm, filled with the soft crackle of a space heater and the faint scent of cedar from the workshop table. Arthur Hayes sat there, a blanket over his knees, pen in hand, paper before him. The hospital stay had left him weaker, though he never said so aloud. He moved slower now, spoke softer. The others noticed, but he brushed it off with the same old phrase, "Just catching my breath." In truth, something inside him knew what breath he was catching, his last calm before a final quiet. He turned the paper slightly, writing across the top in neat, steady letters, "For Luke, when Christmas comes again." The pen hovered for a moment, then began to move. His handwriting, though fragile, carried weight, each line a truth he hadn't spoken out loud. "My boy," he wrote, "if you're reading this, I've gone on ahead. Don't be sad about that. A man can't hold the hammer forever. At some point, he has to set it down and trust the ones who learned from him." He paused, glancing at the small wooden box on the shelf, the one he and Luke had built together in the early days of his recovery. It was simple but beautiful, crafted from oak reclaimed from Arthur's old workshop. He planned to tuck the letter inside when he finished. He kept writing, the words coming like gentle tides. "You spent years chasing wealth, and I spent years chasing your forgiveness. I think we both learned the same lesson in different ways, that love unspent becomes regret. You can lose money, homes, even time, but what you give in kindness, you never lose." He smiled faintly, imagining Luke reading it. "I used to think my pride kept me strong, but pride only looks like strength when you're afraid to say you're wrong. It took me most of a lifetime to see that. Don't let it take you the same." Outside, snow tapped against the window, the sky silver with dusk. Arthur's pen slowed, his hand trembling, but his expression was calm, peaceful. "When you were born," he wrote, "I promised your mother I'd give you a better life than mine. I just didn't realize that meant teaching you to build something inside yourself, not around you. I hope I finally did that." His handwriting wavered near the end, but he steadied it long enough to finish the last line. "Pride wastes time. Love spends it. Spend yours wisely, son. That's the only kind of wealth worth leaving behind." He signed his name, Arthur Hayes, then folded the letter neatly, sliding it into an envelope. His breath came slower now, the world growing soft at the edges. He placed the letter carefully inside the wooden box, closed the lid, and traced its surface with one last, gentle touch. He looked around the apartment, the small workshop corner, the half-finished chair, the photo of his wife and Luke on the wall. Everything was still. Everything was enough. When Luke found him the next morning, the light had already shifted. The heater hummed quietly, coffee still half-filled in a cup beside the chair. Arthur sat as though simply resting, his hands folded peacefully in his lap, the faintest smile still on his lips. For a long moment, Luke just stood there, his breath catching somewhere between disbelief and understanding. He knelt beside the chair, pressing his forehead to his father's shoulder, the tears coming before he could stop them. The room felt impossibly still, yet filled with presence, as though Arthur hadn't left, only stepped into another room. Hours later, as Luke moved through the space, tidying quietly, his hand brushed against the wooden box. He recognized it instantly. When he opened it, the letter waited inside, folded neatly, his father's handwriting steady and strong. He unfolded it slowly, eyes scanning every line, tears falling freely as he read. The words reached him not as sorrow, but as something purer, like grace. When he reached the final line, "Pride wastes time, love spends it," he pressed his fingers to the ink, as though he could feel the pulse that once wrote it. Outside, the snow fell heavier, soft and silent, the world blanketed once again in peace. Luke sat by the window for a long time, the letter open in his hands, the wood box resting beside him. He didn't cry anymore. The ache in his chest had changed, no longer sharp, but deep and steady, like the echo of love that refuses to end. He looked out at the snowfall, at the white flakes drifting over the city, and whispered, "I'll spend it right this time, Dad." And as the snow gathered on the windowsill, the faintest ray of morning light broke through the clouds, catching the wooden box on the table, its surface glowing softly like a soul that never really left. The morning of the funeral was quiet, wrapped in a thin veil of fog. The air was still and cold, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. Beneath a small grove of evergreens on the edge of Maple Grove Cemetery, a simple wooden casket rested beside a mound of fresh soil. No marble, no gold trim, no grand procession, just the kind of dignity Arthur Hayes would have wanted. The ceremony was small but full. Old neighbors came, the ones who remembered his laughter echoing through his old workshop on summer evenings. A few of Luke's former employees arrived, heads bowed, whispering about how Arthur had once stopped by their office just to thank them for their work. And there were the apprentices, young men and women from the community trade school, standing in quiet lines, their hands rough from labor, their eyes full of reverence. Snow flurried lightly, the first of the season, soft as breath. Luke stood near the casket, his gloved hands trembling around a folded paper. Rebecca was beside him, clutching his arm, her eyes red but dry. She had inherited her grandfather's calm, even in sorrow. The pastor's words were brief, simple prayers, a reminder of a life spent building, teaching, giving. But when it came time to speak, Luke stepped forward. The crowd hushed as he unfolded the letter in his hands. The paper creased and faintly yellowed. His voice trembled at first. "I found this in his workshop," he began. "It's a letter he wrote called, 'For Luke, When Christmas Comes Again.' I'd like to share a little of it." He cleared his throat, fighting to steady himself, and began reading. "My boy, if you're reading this, I've gone on ahead. Don't be sad about that. A man can't hold the hammer forever. At some point, he has to set it down and trust the ones who learned from him." Luke paused, his voice breaking. He looked out over the crowd, familiar faces, strangers, all of them listening. "He always said life wasn't about keeping what you built," Luke continued softly. "It was about passing it on." He read another passage. "You can lose money, homes, even time, but what you give in kindness, you never lose. Pride wastes time, love spends it." Luke's voice cracked on the last words. He stopped reading, folding the letter carefully, his hands trembling. "He gave everything," he said, his gaze lowering to the casket, "even what I didn't deserve." The silence that followed was deep and full, like the world itself was holding its breath. Rebecca slipped her small hand into his, her grip firm, grounding him. He looked down at her and managed a faint, grateful smile. The pastor nodded gently. A hymn began, low, unaccompanied, the melody carried by a handful of voices. The sound of it wove through the trees, soft against the winter air. When the final words faded, Luke stepped forward once more, laying his father's old carpenter's pencil on top of the casket. The same pencil Arthur had used to mark his final measurements, now serving as the last one. Rebecca placed a small wooden bird beside it, the first project she'd built with her grandfather. As the coffin was lowered, church bells from the town in the distance began to ring. Slow, deliberate, 12 soft notes that echoed across the valley. The sound lingered, carried on the cold wind, until only silence remained. Luke stood still long after the others had begun to leave. He looked up through the trees, the branches swaying gently, flakes of snow drifting down through the light. Rebecca tugged his sleeve. "Dad?" He looked down at her. "Yeah?" She pointed toward the open sky. "He's okay now." Luke nodded, unable to speak. They stood there together, the last two to leave, watching the snow settle over the fresh earth. It didn't feel like an ending, not really. More like the first quiet page of something new. As the bells faded completely into the distance, Luke whispered under his breath, "See you when Christmas comes again, Dad." And for the first time since Arthur's passing, peace didn't feel like absence. It felt like presence, finally at rest, beneath the pines. Spring melted into summer, and with it came a new rhythm, one Arthur would have approved of. The old workshop that had once stood half forgotten on the edge of town was alive again. Luke unlocked its doors for the first time in months, the faint scent of dust and cedar greeting him like an old friend. The light streamed in through high windows, catching on the suspended dust and turning it to gold. The place still held his father's touch, his handwriting scrawled across old notes pinned to the walls, measurements etched into the wooden workbench, the familiar squeak of the floorboards that no one ever bothered to fix. Luke ran his hand across the surface of the table where Arthur had spent decades shaping, repairing, teaching. "All right, Dad," he whispered, "let's make it count this time." He'd spent weeks planning, rebuilding, repainting. Every nail, every board, every brushstroke felt like a conversation with the past. When it was done, he hung a new sign above the entrance, a simple wooden plank carved with care. Hayes Hands, built with love. The name felt right, not grand, not corporate, just honest. Opening day came on a warm Saturday morning. A crowd of townspeople gathered, some old, some young, many of them familiar faces from Arthur's life. Local apprentices from the trade school came to help, their hands rough and eager. Rebecca stood beside Luke, clipboard in hand, eyes bright with purpose. She was running the books now, organizing the schedules, greeting the new students as they arrived. Luke took a deep breath before cutting the ribbon. "My father always said," he began, voice carrying just enough for the small crowd to hear, "that hands tell the truth about a person. He built this place so people could learn to make things that last. Today we get to keep that promise." The applause was soft, genuine. Someone shouted, "Arthur would be proud," and Luke had to look away for a moment, blinking against the sting in his eyes. Inside, the workshop hummed with life again. Hammers tapped, saws hummed. Laughter rose and echoed off the rafters. The scent of fresh-cut wood filled the air, mingling with the sound of possibility. Luke moved through the room slowly, watching as students measured, glued, sanded, and talked with the easy excitement of beginners. Each table was marked with a plaque bearing a simple inscription, "Measure twice, cut once." It was Arthur's mantra, now immortalized in brass. Rebecca walked over, hair pulled back, a pencil tucked behind her ear, just like her grandfather used to do. "We're full for the next 2 sessions," she said proudly. "Word's spreading fast. The trade school wants to partner with us for scholarships." Luke smiled. "Your grandfather would have liked that." She nodded, looking around. "He's here. You can feel it." He glanced up at the beams above, the ones Arthur had once reinforced himself. The light filtering through the windows fell across the benches, and for a heartbeat, Luke could almost see his father there, his hands steady, his posture relaxed, his quiet hum under the sound of work. The day went on with the simple beauty of creation. Students carved small boxes, sanded planks, built stools and shelves. Sawdust covered the floor, sunlight catching in the air like glitter. The smell of wood and oil, once the scent of regret, now felt like redemption. As the afternoon waned, Luke stood in the doorway, watching Rebecca help a younger student fix a misaligned hinge. The sound of their laughter filled the space. This was what his father had built, not just furniture, but people. A place where second chances took shape, where mistakes became lessons, where humility lived in the grain of every board. Luke's gaze drifted to the sign again, Hayes Hands, built with love. He smiled quietly to himself. "You did it, Dad," he murmured. "We both did." The sun dipped lower, throwing warm light through the windows. The students cleaned their tools. Rebecca balanced the ledger, and the last echoes of laughter faded into contented silence. Luke lingered a moment longer, running his palm over the smooth surface of the old workbench. The wood was cool beneath his hand, steady, like his father's voice still lived there, whispering the same lesson he'd left behind in ink. Pride wastes time. Love spends it. He looked around the room once more, filled now with new builders, new beginnings, new hands shaping tomorrow. And for the first time, he didn't feel the ache of loss. He felt legacy turning into purpose. And that, he thought, was its own kind of forever. It was the first snow of the season, the kind that came without warning, soft and slow, falling like time itself, returning for one more visit. The flakes drifted through the quiet streets of Maple Grove, settling gently on rooftops, fences, and pine branches. Through the window of Luke Hayes's modest home, the world looked wrapped in silver. Inside, warmth radiated from the small living room. The table was set with care, simple plates, mismatched silverware, a faded tablecloth that once belonged to Arthur. There were candles burning low, and the faint smell of cinnamon and roasted vegetables filled the air. Laughter floated in from the kitchen, where Rebecca was stirring gravy, humming a carol under her breath. It had been exactly 1 year since Arthur's passing. Luke stood in the doorway, holding a dish towel in one hand, watching the snow fall outside. For a long time, Christmas had been a season of guilt. Too much left unsaid, too much time wasted. But this year felt different. The house didn't echo with regret anymore. It hummed with quiet gratitude. "Dad," Rebecca called from the kitchen, "can you grab the bread from the oven before I burn it again?" He smiled faintly. "On it, chef." When he opened the oven, a wave of heat fogged his glasses. He laughed softly, remembering how his father used to tease him about his careless hands. He could almost hear Arthur's voice, steady and warm. "Measure twice, Luke." He set the bread on the counter, golden and uneven, and called out, "Looks edible this time." Rebecca peeked around the corner. "Barely," she said with a grin. "You really are Grandpa's son." Luke's smile faltered, just for a second. Bittersweet, but no longer painful. "That's the best compliment I'll ever get." By 6 o'clock, the guests had arrived. Just a handful of people this year. A couple of apprentices from Hayes Hands, one of Luke's old colleagues, Rebecca's friend from college. The table filled with chatter. Clinking glasses, soft laughter. It wasn't grand, but it was honest. At the center of the table sat one empty chair. Luke had set it intentionally, though no one spoke of it. On the plate before it lay a folded napkin and a small wooden birdhouse ornament, the first thing Rebecca had built with Arthur. When the plates were served and the candles flickered low, Rebecca stood, holding a small framed photo. It was Arthur, smiling in his workshop, eyes squinting from the sunlight coming through the window. She placed it gently on the empty chair. "For Grandpa," she said simply. Everyone grew quiet. The sound of the snow against the windows became the only thing moving. Luke looked around the table, at the faces, at the warmth, and felt something in his chest unclench. He reached for his glass. "Before we eat," he began softly, "I'd like to say something." Every eye turned toward him. "This last year taught me that time doesn't heal everything, but it teaches, if you're willing to listen." His gaze flicked briefly to the photograph, then back to the room. "My father used to say, 'Pride wastes time, but love spends it.' I didn't understand that until it was almost too late. But tonight, I think I finally do." He lifted his glass, his voice steady, filled with quiet conviction. "To time, the greatest teacher." The others echoed softly, raising their glasses. "To time." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was gentle, full of meaning, an unspoken gratitude shared between everyone there. The flicker of candlelight danced across Arthur's photo, making it seem almost alive, his smile caught mid-laugh. As dinner began, conversation flowed easily. Stories of Arthur filled the air, his quirks, his sayings, his stubborn humor. Rebecca laughed so hard at one memory that she wiped tears from her eyes. "He used to tell me sawdust was just wood confetti," she said, shaking her head. Luke chuckled. "He said the same thing to me when I was 8. I believed him for years." The night unfolded slowly, beautifully. No tension, no unspoken words. Just warmth, the kind that lingers after the plates are cleared and the lights grow dim. After everyone left, Luke stood by the window again, looking out at the snow-covered street. The world was quiet, glowing under the soft pulse of Christmas lights. He turned toward the dining table, toward the empty chair and the photo still sitting there. He walked over, rested a hand lightly on the frame, and whispered, "Merry Christmas, Dad." Outside, the wind carried a soft creak from the trees, almost like an answer. For the first time in decades, Luke's house didn't feel empty. It felt lived in, loved in. The kind of home Arthur Hayes had always believed could be built, not with money, but with forgiveness, patience, and time. And as the snow kept falling, Luke smiled to himself, realizing the truth his father had written all those years ago. Endings, when built with love, always find their way back into beginnings. The air outside the community center was crisp, the kind of cold that carried both ache and clarity. Snowflakes drifted lazily past the high windows, their soft descent reflecting the light from inside. The hall had been decorated simply: wooden centerpieces, white linens, small sprigs of pine. Nothing extravagant, nothing to distract from what mattered. At the front of the room, a banner read, "The Arthur Hayes Foundation, building futures with honest hands." Luke stood behind the podium, adjusting the microphone, his reflection caught faintly in the polished surface. He wasn't nervous this time, not in the way he used to be. There were no shareholders here, no reporters looking for scandal, just apprentices, teachers, local families, and a few quiet cameras streaming the event online. Rebecca stood off to the side, managing the live stream. She smiled when he looked her way, mouthing, "You've got this." He gave a small nod and began. "When my father passed," Luke said, his voice clear and steady, "I thought the best way to honor him was to rebuild what he'd created. The workshop, the classes, the apprenticeships." He paused, glancing toward the photo of Arthur displayed beside the podium, his father in his workshop, sleeves rolled up, eyes squinting under the same worn cap. "But I realized something," Luke continued. "My father never built for himself. He built for others. And now it's my turn." He took a slow breath, steadying the emotion rising in his throat. "Today, I'm proud to announce the expansion of my father's original trust into a national scholarship program, the Arthur Hayes Foundation. Its goal is simple: to give young builders, craftsmen, and dreamers a chance to learn what my father taught me, that real wealth doesn't come from what you own, but from what you make with your hands and your heart." The room was silent, the kind of silence that holds reverence. Luke smiled faintly, his eyes glistening. "My father taught me what wealth truly means," he said. The words hung in the air like a prayer. He gestured toward the stage where the first scholarship recipients sat, nervous young men and women clutching their envelopes. "Each of you carries his legacy forward. Remember, every mark you make, every project you finish, it's not just wood or metal or craft. It's a promise to build something honest, to leave something that lasts." The audience stood in applause, slow at first, then rising like a wave. Some clapped through tears. Others bowed their heads in quiet respect. Luke stepped back from the microphone, overwhelmed by the sound, by the sight of faces moved not by pity, but by shared belief. Rebecca joined him on stage, handing him a small box. Inside, engraved on a metal plaque, were the words Arthur once wrote in his journal: "Measure life by the hands you help, not the things you hold." Luke ran his thumb across the engraving, his vision blurring. "Thank you," he whispered. The applause continued, echoing through the hall, filling every corner of the space his father had once dreamed of but never lived to see. As the ceremony ended, Luke stood by the window, looking out into the snowfall. The world beyond the glass was soft, muted, endless. Each flake that fell seemed to move in slow motion, like time choosing to linger. Rebecca came to stand beside him. He'd be proud, you know, she said. Luke nodded. I hope so. He would, she said firmly, because this isn't just his foundation anymore. It's yours too. He turned to her and smiled, his reflection in the window merging faintly with the photo of Arthur hanging nearby. Father and son, both builders, both flawed, both redeemed by the same lesson. Outside, the snow kept falling. It gathered quietly on the window ledges, on the world below, soft, unhurried, infinite. Luke watched it, the faintest tear slipping down his cheek, catching the light before falling away. And in that quiet, the applause still echoing in his ears, he whispered the words that had guided him here, words that belonged to both of them now, built with love, always. The snow had returned, almost exactly a year to the day. It came in slow flurries, gentle and familiar, the kind that blanketed the world without hurry. Inside Hayes' hands, the smell of sawdust and varnish filled the air, blending with the faint hum of conversation and the rhythmic tap of tools. Luke Hayes stood near the front window, his hands resting on the sill, watching flakes drift past the glass. The world looked softer when it snowed, quieter, forgiving. Behind him, a voice spoke. Mr. Hayes, thank you again for agreeing to meet. He turned and smiled at the young woman setting up her recorder on the table. She was from the Maple Grove Chronicle, the same paper that had once chronicled his downfall, his father's letter, his redemption. Time, it seemed, had its own sense of poetry. Of course, Luke said, though I'm not sure there's much left to tell. She smiled. Our readers would disagree. It's been 5 years since your father's passing and 1 year since you launched the Arthur Hayes Foundation. People see what you've done here. They just want to know what it all means to you now. Luke took a seat, his eyes flicking to the framed photo of Arthur hanging above the door. The same image had followed him from the workshop to every event since. A compass, more than a portrait. He took a breath. You know, he began slowly, when people talk about inheritance, they think of money, land, maybe a business. I thought that too once. The journalist leaned forward, intrigued. But my inheritance, Luke continued, voice steady but low, was a second chance. The words hung in the air, simple yet heavy. He smiled faintly. It didn't come with a signature or a will. It came with forgiveness, with learning how to build something honest after breaking so much. She nodded thoughtfully, jotting notes. You've rebuilt a lot in the last few years, this foundation, your reputation. But may I ask about your personal life? Luke chuckled softly, looking down at his hands. You mean Molly? The reporter hesitated, then smiled awkwardly. Yes, sir. He leaned back in his chair, eyes distant. Funny thing about time, it makes truth look different when you revisit it. After Dad died, Molly reached out, not for money or sympathy, just regret. She said she'd been angry at the wrong things, that she'd mistaken ambition for meaning. He paused, glancing toward the office door where faint laughter echoed from the workshop beyond. We don't live together anymore, but we talk. We celebrate holidays together with Rebecca. We even manage to laugh again. It's not romance. It's something simpler. Peace. The journalist smiled softly. That's rare, Luke nodded. It is, but it's enough. There was a quiet knock on the door. Rebecca peeked in, clipboard in hand. Dad, we need your signature on the new apprentice contracts. Luke grinned. Give me 2 minutes. She nodded and stepped out, the door clicking shut behind her. The journalist watched her go. Your daughter seems Remarkable. She is, Luke said, pride softening his tone. She's running most of the operations now. The kids love her. She's patient, like her grandfather was. Has that same calm fire. He smiled to himself. I think Dad would have handed her the keys himself if he were here. The journalist looked around the workshop, the shelves stacked with projects, the chatter from students, the life buzzing in every corner. It's amazing, isn't it? She said quietly. Everything came full circle. Luke's gaze shifted back to the window. The snow was falling heavier now, flakes drifting past the glass like fragments of old memories returning home. Full circle, he repeated softly. Yeah, I guess it did. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The workshop sounds faded into the soft hum of the heater and the quiet rhythm of winter outside. Finally, Luke stood, walking to the window again. You know, he said almost to himself, I used to think redemption was something you achieved, but it's not. It's something you maintain. Like this place, you keep sweeping, keep fixing, keep showing up. The reporter clicked off her recorder, sensing the interview was over. Luke watched the snow fall, a faint smile crossing his face. My father built a life out of truth, he said. I'm just trying to keep it standing. And as the camera shutter clicked one last photo, the sun framed in his father's light, snow drifting beyond the glass. The world outside seemed to echo what Arthur had always believed. Some legacies aren't inherited. They're earned, one honest day at a time. The hall was filled with a low hum of conversation, the kind that carries warmth instead of noise. The Arthur Hayes Foundation event had become an annual tradition now, part celebration, part remembrance, part continuation. The banners were simple, cream-colored with oak-brown lettering. At the front of the stage hung a large, framed photograph. Arthur Hayes in his workshop, caught mid-laugh, a streak of sawdust on his sleeve. Luke stood beside the podium, watching people file in, young apprentices, parents, teachers, and townsfolk who'd been touched, directly or indirectly, by his father's legacy. The smell of fresh-cut pine still clung to his hands from helping set up the wooden displays earlier that morning. He liked that. It felt right, like carrying a piece of Arthur with him. Rebecca adjusted the microphone and smiled. Ready? Luke nodded. Yeah, ready. The lights dimmed, the chatter faded. A hush rolled over the audience as a gentle melody began to play. Strings and piano, soft, reflective. The projector flickered to life behind him, filling the wall with black and white images. Arthur teaching a child to plane wood, shaking hands with a neighbor, standing outside the old workshop before the restoration. Luke took a slow breath and began to read. This was found in my father's journal, he said, his voice steady but threaded with emotion. He never meant for it to be a speech, but I think he'd be okay with me sharing it. He unfolded the page, the edges worn from years of careful handling. Arthur's voice, gentle and weathered, filled the room, not spoken aloud, but felt in every word Luke read. If you ever count riches, start with the people who stand beside you, the ones who stay when things fall apart, who show up when the world doesn't. Those are the only treasures that don't rust or fade. The melody swelled softly beneath his words, and the screen behind him shifted. A montage of hands working wood, sanding edges, steadying beams. Children from the foundation appeared next, carving their first pieces, laughing through the mistakes. Luke continued, his tone low and reverent. I spent too many years chasing the wrong kind of wealth. Thought success meant applause, not peace. But the older I got, the more I realized that time is the only true currency. How you spend it, that's your legacy. Luke paused, his throat tightening. He looked out across the audience, faces young and old, many he knew, some he didn't. Yet they were all part of what Arthur had built, what they had rebuilt together. He turned the page, his voice softening. If you're reading this, it means I've gone on ahead. Don't mourn too long. Instead, build something, not to be remembered, but to be useful. Leave behind something that works, something that heals, something that matters. The camera, if this were a film, would move through the workshop now, through the present day. The children shaping wood with concentration, the teachers guiding them with patience, Rebecca laughing as she helped a student reattach a hinge. The hum of creation alive in every corner. Luke swallowed hard, finishing the final paragraph. When your hands are tired, rest them. When your heart is heavy, open it. And when you count your blessings, count people twice. Everything good I ever built started with love, and so should you. The hall was silent when he stopped reading. The music lingered, just piano now, a few fading chords. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then someone began to clap. Slow, steady. Others joined until the room filled with applause that didn't sound like celebration, but gratitude. Luke smiled faintly, his eyes glistening. He looked up at the photo of his father, then down at the plaque mounted on the podium. The engraving gleamed under the soft light. Built by a father, rebuilt by a son. Outside the tall windows, snow had begun to fall, fine and steady, catching the light from the street lamps and scattering it through the glass. The flakes drifted inward like dust from another world, painting the room in soft brightness. Rebecca stepped up beside him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "He'd love this," she whispered. Luke nodded. "He's here." They both turned toward the windows, watching the snow swirl, the reflection of the workshop's wooden beams visible in the glass. The light shimmered across the room, the same glow that had once filtered through Arthur's workshop, warm and golden. Luke took one last look at the audience, the children smiling, the apprentices beaming, the families proud, and spoke quietly into the microphone. "My father used to say truth and love are the only things you can build that don't collapse. Thank you all for proving him right." The music swelled again, a rising crescendo, hopeful but calm. The camera would move slowly through the hall, lingering on faces, on hands, brushing sawdust from tables, on the wooden pieces carved with initials and dreams. Then gently, it would pan up to the plaque again. Built by a father, rebuilt by a son. Snowlight filtered through the windows, glimmering like forgiveness itself, soft, endless, eternal. And as the last note of the piano faded, the screen, or the world, dissolved into white. Fade out, peace, earned through truth.